Hello, hello, hello. How are you? Folks, I can't tell you how happy I am to see all of you here tonight. Can't tell you how happy I am. Talking to you all is the highlight of my day. I'll tell you, folks, this morning I did an interview on Sputnik Radio. I went back to sleep. I took care of some work a little bit later. I went for my daily jog, got myself all sweaty, took a shower, did some reading to prepare for tonight, and now I am here for the highlight of my day to talk with all of you, to engage with my political family, my brothers and my sisters, my comrades. We are on a journey together, wrangling with big questions, trying to figure out how we can save our country, save our community, save the world from the disaster of profits and greed. You all are here, and I'm happy that you're here. And we're going to have a great conversation tonight. If you haven't already done it, now is the time to hit that like button. The more likes, the better this channel does, the bigger this conversation becomes. Hit the subscribe button. Make sure that you're still subscribed. We know that YouTube has a weird algorithm thing where people get unsubscribed. So be sure to hit that subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notification button. A lot of people have been not getting the notifications properly. It's a little bit mysterious. We don't want our tech overlords, our Silicon Valley elites to prevent us from having the important community conversations that we like to have. So be sure to hit the notifications bell. If you want to post this as a Facebook status, please do that. If you want to tweet this out, make a tweet, oh my God, what did Caleb just say? Do that. Welcome your friends into the conversation. Bring your favorite subreddit on Reddit on board. Post this on Facebook. Post this on Twitter. The more that are here to be part of our lovely community, the happier all of us will be. You all are so special to me. And I assume that because you're taking the time to listen to me, that I am special to you. We're going to engage. I will take super chats as they come in, but for the first little bit, I'll be writing them down. I won't be addressing them until after we do our roll call. So I'll start out with the introductory comments that I've prepared. Then we'll do our roll call. Then I'll start responding to your questions. I know many people have things they want to talk about, and I'm always happy to talk about whatever it is that people want to talk about, but I do have some things I want to get to first, some updates that I think are important. Folks, we're all stuck at home. We've got our phones and computers. We've got our television sets. And in my case, I kind of regret signing up, but I do have a subscription to The Economist, the voice of British economics, of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, that's what I've got here. People are saying my mic sounds raspy. Well, nothing I can do about that. I'm just going to keep talking. The Economist is the voice of neoliberalism. It is the voice of British economics, the London School of Economics. I'll bring you a little closer. Perhaps that'll make a difference in the mic and the sound quality. The voice of British economics. And you'll notice that the cover article, A Dangerous Gap, Markets versus the Real Economy, they're warning us that something isn't right. The past 8 weeks have been remarkable nonetheless. A gut-wrenching sell-off in shares has been followed by a delirious rally in America. Between February 19th and March 23rd, the S&P 500 lost a third of its value. With barely a pause, it has skyrocketed, recovering more than half of its loss. The catalyst was the news that the Federal Reserve would buy corporate bonds, helping firms, big finance firms, with their debts. Investors shifted from panic to optimism without missing a beat. This rosy view from Wall Street should make you uneasy. Even as the lockdown eases in America, the blow to jobs has been savage, with unemployment rising from 4% to 16%, the highest rate on record since the records began in 1948. With big firm shares soaring, they get help from the Fed. Small businesses are struggling. America's GDP is expected to drop by 10% in the second quarter. Many individual bosses hope that less cost cutting can help protect their margins and pay down debts accumulated with furlough. But in aggregate, this corporate austerity will depress demand. The likely outcome is a 90% economy that will run far below normal levels. And, according to The Economist, the most overlooked risk is a political backlash. A crisis demands sacrifice that will leave a big bill. The clamor for a paycheck will only grow louder if big business is hogged more than its share of the subsidies on offer. It is easy to imagine windfall taxes and bailed out industries. Folks, this points to the reality. All right, I'm asked about my family. All right, writing it down. Folks, this points to the reality of capitalism, that the profits of the rich and the ultra-rich are not directly linked to your conditions. You can get poorer and poorer, and Wall Street can get richer and richer. But I said they're not directly linked, because in a way, they are linked. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism that Karl Marx explained long ago. First, I believe the first place he addressed it, if I'm not mistaken, was in The Poverty of Philosophy, his polemic with the anarchist Proudhon. He later addressed it in Capital, in texts like Wages, Prices, and Profits, eventually in Theories of Surplus Value and other texts that were published after his death. Karl Marx explained that the problem with capitalism is this. Under capitalism, production is carried out in order to make profits for the owners. The banks, factories, and industries function not because people need them, but because capitalists can make money from them. Profits are in command in capitalism. And the problem with this is that the capitalist is constantly looking to maximize profits, and the way the capitalist does this is by driving down labor costs, by eliminating workers and jobs with technology, by making the jobs that do exist de-skillable and more easy to replace so he can pay the workers less and make the workers more afraid for their jobs so they don't demand too much. The capitalist is constantly trying to pay as little as possible in order to produce as much as possible, to maximize production, produce as many goods as possible, but pay the lowest amount for doing so. And this inevitably leads to a big problem, which is those workers are also consumers. And as you drive workers down, as you eliminate their jobs, as you make their jobs de-skilled and less payable, as you lower their wages, as you lower their living standards, as you get the workers deeper in debt to survive, as you rip off workers, as you force them to compete in a global market, as the standard of living for workers goes down and further down and further down and further down. As that takes place, the result is that soon the market is glutted with products that can't be sold. Pretty soon the stores are full of iPhones and iPads. The steel market is full of steel. The oil wells are pumped full of oil. And the working class cannot afford to buy them. And you have a crisis of overproduction. The capitalist economist John Maynard Keynes called it underconsumption. But this is the boom-bust cycle. And the capitalists have worked so hard to try and resolve this boom-bust cycle. They have the Federal Reserve System to pump money into the economy to try and resolve it. They seize foreign markets to dump their excess products on, right? The export of capital, that's part of imperialism, is maintaining developing countries as client states to purchase the excess goods and not develop their own industries. There are many, many efforts by the capitalists to try and overcome this basic built-in problem. But as long as the banks and the factories and the major industries and the natural resources and the major centers of economic power are operated according to profits, You cannot escape this problem. This is the problem inherent in capitalism. Profits in command, production for profit is irrational. And to resolve it, you need society as a whole to take control of the means of production. The people should take control of the major centers of economic power and operate them for public good. Now, the economist is never going to tell you that. They're advocates of neoliberalism. They're advocates of privatizations and austerity. They're advocates of tearing down socialist governments. But anyone who understands economics knows that there's a big problem. There is a very, very big problem, a dangerous gap, as the economist calls it, a dangerous gap. Much was written about jobless recoveries. And they saw this in the lead up to the financial crisis. In 1991, the economy recovered from a brief economic downturn, but it was a jobless recovery. The same thing happened around the time of 9/11, right? Early years of George W. Bush, there was an economic recovery. Wall Street recovered, but there were no new jobs, and the income of average Americans was dropping. And essentially what happened was that the capitalists had developed a mechanism for essentially insulating themselves from the results of their actions. They developed all kinds of means, whereas the standard of living for average Americans could keep going down, and they could continue enriching themselves, like private prisons. Fine, the standard of living for Americans is going down. Things are getting worse for average Americans. So maybe we'll make profits from locking people in prison. Another thing they did to insulate themselves, big pharma, right? So Americans' living standards are going down. Let's get them addicted to opioids, make them dependent on painkillers. That'll ensure our flow of profits even as their ability to purchase goes down, right? Let's create a huge market for psych meds and antidepressants, right? As Americans' lives become unstable, as people's self-esteem decreases, let's turn that into a way to make money. Let's wage more wars. Let's sell weapons to autocratic regimes like the Saudis in the Middle East, like the regimes in Kuwait, like the government of Jordan, like the United Arab Emirates, like the brutal autocracy in Bahrain that oppresses the Shia majority of the population. Let's arm brutal juntas and regimes. Let's build up Taiwan's military to try and threaten the People's Republic of China. Let's send weapons all over the world so that we can keep making profits as the living standard of the American people continues to go down. The capitalists have figured out so many mechanisms for trying to insulate themselves from the natural result of their decisions. But as we saw in 2008, it doesn't work. It only works for so long, but pretty soon things come crashing down. Pretty soon, the capitalists have to face the results of their decision. Their greed brings the chickens home to roost, and we see a financial meltdown that shocks the world. The lead up to the financial crisis of 2008, they say, why were all these smart people so wrong? Alan Greenspan, all the economists of Harvard, how could they not stop this? Let me ask you, could great geologists and great anthropologists, I shouldn't say anthropologists, they study human society, but could great scientists get together and stop a volcano? Right? If you had a volcano that was about to go off, could you assemble great scientists together who understood how volcanoes work, who understood how the lava works and the rock and the plate tectonics, and they understood it, and if you assembled them together, would they be able to stop a volcano from exploding? Of course not. From erupting? Of course not. Of course they wouldn't be able to stop it, because volcanoes erupt. That's what they do. And capitalism leads to economic meltdowns. It's what it does. This is the result of capitalism, labor theory of value. This is the result of capitalism. This is the capitalist crisis. And now in the United States, I read you that part in the article where they're worried about political backlash. They know it's going to give rise to populism. It's going to give rise to people demanding that the state take action to protect their lives, to protect their incomes, to protect their jobs. And that leads me to another point, which is very important to understand. And if you want to understand socialist organizing, you want to understand what's happened in Latin America and what's happened in the socialist movement around the world, you need to understand this. And you need to understand the reaction to it by the global media and capitalism. It seems that right-wing dictators are back in style. Right-wing dictators are back in style. This is a photo from El Salvador, where the right-wing autocrat, Bukele, has so many people, I see that, Shining Path, writing it down, so many people held. Horrendous situation, what's going on in the prisons there. This is an autocratic regime that's repressing workers. And there's mild condemnation of it from liberal sources. But why is it there? Why is it there? I don't want you to fall over there. I got to hold the tripod there. Writing it down. Shining Path. What's going on? Well, during the Cold War, the United States government had a policy of backing right-wing strongmen, like Trujillo, right, in the Dominican Republic. Right-wing, torturing, murdering dictator. Marcos in the Philippines. Go down the line. Suharto. Who else? Park Chung-hee and Syngman Rhee in South Korea. The majority of South Korea's existence hasn't been democracy. It's been military dictatorships. Why is it, Somoza in Nicaragua, very good, Genghis Khan, why is it that these dictators were being backed? Well, they were being backed to stabilize society, to stabilize countries, and lock them down to prevent communist revolution, right? Guatemala, right? They had a democratic government in Guatemala, and the result was a socialistic president, Jacobo Arbenz, who was in an alliance with the Communist Party, getting elected. And so the USA toppled Arbenz and installed a military dictator in Guatemala to make sure that no socialistic government came into power. You had Batista in Cuba. Why was the United States doing this? It was to lock down these countries, to lock them down. And actually, what you saw, especially during the Kennedy administration and Lyndon Johnson, we're talking the 1960s, is there was an effort to help these right-wing dictators raise living standards, right? There was so much economic growth going on in the socialist countries that it became necessary for the U.S. government to start loaning money to these dictators and letting them build up a kind of middle class that would support them. In South Korea, we saw that the United States forced Japan to loan millions of dollars to Park Chung-hee and to create POSCO, to create the steel industry. And that created a layer of middle-class people, of well-paid middle-class workers in South Korea that would be loyal to the military dictatorship so that the socialists and communists could be crushed. And it was brutal. They had prison camps. They rounded up orphan children and worked them to death. There were horrendous things done. But in order to do it, you had to create a middle class. And in Latin America, it was the same way. In Chile, in Argentina, in many different countries, you saw the United States loaning money, the United States basically enabling these countries to develop some layer of their own manufacturing, their own mining, their own industries, to try and stabilize the dictatorships, to create a middle-class strata in these countries that would be anti-communist. So at the same time, in the urban centers, they're executing communists, they're breaking the trade unions, they're sending people to prison camps. They're also raising the living standards, right? They're creating a layer. And that's generally how Bonapartist regimes or dictatorships tend to work, right? If you're going to have an autocratic military state that's capitalist, you're going to need to maintain a layer that is loyal to it. In Nazi Germany, for example, right? Hitler did a lot to maintain a layer of German workers that were loyal to his regime. And that if you're going to have an autocratic regime like that. And so what happened? Well, the communists had to flee from the cities and go into the countryside. Che Guevara, right? Guevaranism. Fidel Castro. The Cuban Revolution wasn't made. It didn't start out in the cities. It started out in the countryside. The cities, there was so much support for the regime. There was so much political repression, it wasn't going to work. But they went to the countryside to wage the revolution. And Many revolutions followed this pattern. Nicaragua, the revolution started in the countryside. Communists went into the countryside and waged guerrilla warfare to fight against the imperialists, and that was how they had to organize. Writing it down, China and AI. That was how they had to organize. And it worked to some degree. Nicaragua had a socialist revolution in 1979. El Salvador had socialist uprisings. There was moderate success for that strategy. But things started to change. The first major change was in Chile. Right? In Chile, you had free elections. You had a socialist government that got elected. You had Salvador Allende, the socialist president, who was elected. Then in 1973, you had a coup, and Pinochet took power. Pinochet was a military dictator, but he was different. He was different from the other military strongmen throughout Latin America at the time, because Pinochet was not a Bonapartist. Pinochet did not implement policies to try and stabilize Chile. Pinochet opened Chile up to being economically looted. He sold it off to the highest bidder. He killed communists, he killed trade union organizers. It was a brutal military coup, but he didn't do what Park Chung-hee did. He didn't do what Batista did. He didn't do what the various strongmen, the Shah of Iran, did. He didn't build up a middle class. He actively worked with Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys to demolish the middle class of Chile. That's what he did. Very different policy, right? Chile had 20 to 30% unemployment. The jobs of the miners were their wages decreased. The food subsidies were just gotten rid of. There was mass starvation. Children became mentally disabled for the rest of their lives because of extreme childhood malnutrition in the aftermath of the coup. Horrendous results. The economic fallout of Milton Friedman's demented experiment in Chile, 1848. The economic fallout from it was demented. And 1970, writing it down, Black September. The economic fallout was horrendous. People suffered en masse. It was disastrous, but it was a military dictatorship that was allowing neoliberal economics. It was looting. And we saw the following later in Argentina. The same thing happened. The relative of Perón, Isabel Perón, toppled a U.S.-backed military dictatorship that privatized everything. Bolivia, right? Similar situation. And especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, you saw a new wave of economic reforms in Latin America, where these anti-communist governments, backed by the United States, were not creating a middle class. They were allowing international banks to just loot their countries, to make them poorer, to sell off their assets, to destroy their domestic industries. But at the same time, there started to be a shift, right? Because there was not economic Bonapartism going on, you saw a political opening up, right? The ruling classes of South America, of Latin America, would prefer to have a more rule-by-consensus government. They would prefer to not have one military leader make all the decisions. They would prefer that there be things more open. Furthermore, the U.S. government would prefer it that way too, because they don't want some kind of big, strong military leader who could tell them no, and that happened, right? These military dictators that the USA was backing would occasionally make demands and force the United States, twist the arm of the United States to give them more loans, give them more money. They didn't like that. Instead of wanting strongmen, right-wing strongmen who could deliver the goods, kill the communists, and stabilize society, the United States started wanting economic neoliberalism to loot the country, number one, and they wanted to have free elections so that the governments became weak. They wanted weak governments that they could just push over to get everything that they wanted. That's what they wanted. They wanted governments that were so small, pathetic, and weak, they could drown them in the bathtub. They wanted weak, pathetic governments that would be able to be forced to implement neoliberal economics. And it was a shift. It was a shift in how the politics worked. No more, starting in the late 80s, 90s, no more did the United States seem to want, right-wing military dictatorships. Instead, they wanted open societies that would allow unlimited free trade economics, but open in the sense that there were multiple party elections, that there was some freedom of the press, some freedom of religion. We started to see that. That was a shift, right? And a lot of these military regimes fell. In Chile, we saw Pinochet forced out of office, and we saw governments coming into power across Latin America that were open, where they would have free elections, and they would sign on with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the country would be economically looted, right? In Venezuela, right? I talked to Venezuelans about this when I was there. I heard their stories about how every year, in order to get their IMF loan, they would have to cut government spending. The government would say, you're being spent, the IMF, the World Bank would say, you're spending too much money. You are spending too much money on sanitation workers. So in parts of the country, in order to get their loan money, in parts of the country, the garbage would stop being collected. In parts of the country, the electricity would stop going on because the IMF and the World Bank would say things like, oh, you're spending too much money. You are spending too much money on maintaining those public power plants. In Bolivia, the water, the rainwater, was sold off to American corporations. They privatized the water. The water was privatized. All the natural resources, the oil, the mining was privatized. In Venezuela, there were big cuts in public transportation, and it was an explosion, a popular rebellion against the rise in costs of public transportation that was called the Caracazo. The Caracazo, it was an explosion, and it was that gave birth to the rise of Bolivarianism in Latin America. But here's the thing. Here's what happened. Because the situation had changed. Before, communists couldn't organize in the cities. Before, communists couldn't participate in elections. So they ran to the countryside and they waged guerrilla warfare among the peasantry. But things changed. Things drastically changed in the 1990s. And communists in Latin America, meeting in Cuba, having big international meetings, understood Iranian fuel tankers, right, all right. Communists in Latin America understood that their tactics had to drastically change. The conditions had changed, and so their tactics had to change. And there was a complete reorientation. And the communists of Latin America switched their tactics. Instead of trying to wage guerrilla warfare in the countryside, because it was impossible to take power peacefully, because it was impossible to organize in the cities, they flipped. And they went back into the cities, and they built coalitions with priests and with labor unions. And they were able to build strong alliances against neoliberalism. Let's remember, in 1999, when Hugo Chavez first took office in Venezuela, he was not in favor of socialism. He said he was for neither capitalism or socialism. He was for what is best. What is best for Venezuela. But we saw in 2003, he announced that Venezuela was building 21st century socialism. Bolivia, movement towards socialism, Evo Morales elected, understanding that his election was a referendum on neoliberalism. The Sandinistas were voted back into power in 2006 after they had been voted out of office. They were voted back into power, making clear that they were the candidates who would stand against neoliberalism. And the communists, because the communists could shift their tactics, instead of waging guerrilla warfare in the countryside, They organized in the cities. Instead of going it alone and using violence, they used peaceful means and organized popular fronts, coalitions, political parties that were polarizing the country against neoliberalism and economic cuts, working with priests, working with trade unionists, working with associations, getting communist groups, Trotskyists, Maoists, Marxist Leninist parties, Social Democrats, all to work together in a popular front because they were able to drastically change their tactics. To really drastically change things, we saw socialism suddenly on the rise. They had announced after the fall of the Soviet Union that socialism was dead. Socialism, oh, it's dead, it'll never rise. But pretty soon it was rising in Venezuela, it was rising in Bolivia, it was rising in Ecuador, it was rising in Nicaragua, it was rising in Brazil. You saw the growth of socialist parties, you saw a social democratic administration with a strong communist faction backing it. All over Latin America, you saw a rise in socialism and Marxism once again. And why? Why? It was because the communists had been willing to change their tactics. They saw what was working, what was not working. They understood that conditions changed, so they changed their tactics. They turned around. And the Chinese Revolution, going way back, we're going back to the 1920s and 30s. The Chinese Revolution happened for the same reason. Mao was a brilliant organizer. His family were middle peasants. They were somewhat wealthier, but they were from the countryside. But the Chinese Communist Party had operated only in the cities. The Chinese Communist Party, the Trotskyite faction wanted them to form independent trade unions and such. The majority faction that was supported by the Communist International wanted to go into the KMT and into the nationalist movement and recruit, which was the correct thing to do. But they worked within the cities. Right? They operated within the cities when the overwhelming majority of the population of China was in the countryside. But in 1927, there's a huge uprising in Hunan province. And so Mao, someone who grew up in the countryside, is sent to go to Hunan to try and figure out what's happening. And he goes to the Hunan province. And in the Hunan province, he sees that the peasants are rising like a storm. He writes, all of those who've been downtrodden in the dirt, who've never had a voice in society, are rising up like a mighty storm and smashing the trammels that bind them. Those are his words. And he writes this beautiful essay, Report on the Peasant Uprising in Hunan, published in 1927, and it's a burning polemic against his own party, because he sees that his own party is ignoring a huge social development. He writes that when the masses are in motion and the people are rising, you have three choices: to stand behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, to denounce them, or to stand at their head and lead them. And every Chinese will be free to choose, but they must make the choice now. Read that 1927 essay, Report on the Peasant Uprising in Hunan. It burns with passion because Mao is seeing this huge social explosion happen all across China. And his own party, the Communist Party, is ignoring it because they have contempt for the peasantry, because the uprising is particularly bloody. And that's where Mao's famous quote, he writes, a revolution is not a dinner party. It's not painting a picture or doing an embroidery. It's an act of violence, whereas one class violently overthrows another. This is Mao's most famous essay. And what is he doing? He's doing exactly what the communists of Latin America were urged to do. He's urging his own party to turn around, to go in a different direction, to change tactics because conditions changed. And pretty soon, the Chinese Communist Party, as we know, was forced to change its tactics. The KMT, the Nationalist Party, started killing communists. The communists were forced to flee to the countryside, and pretty soon, Mao had formed the People's Liberation Army among the peasantry. And it was a peasant revolution. Socialism was brought to China largely by the peasant population. A lot of students, a lot of urban trade unionists, but it was the peasantry that made the Chinese Revolution. And if the Chinese Communist Party hadn't been able to turn things around, socialism would never have come to China. This is an important understanding for anyone who is serious about Marxism and socialism. If you are able to turn things around, to change how you see things, to reorient yourself to new conditions, there is hope. But if you get stuck in a rut, if you get stuck in a routine, if you start trying to act out what people did in the past, if you're LARPing, if you're sticking to a permanent tactical orientation, if you're making the same mistake over and over and over again, if you do that, you can't call yourself a revolutionary. The success of revolutions throughout history have always been based on the ability of communists to rapidly turn things around, to change their tactics dramatically in order to move toward taking power. The Bolshevik Revolution, a great example. Lenin came along and he said a loose association is not going to do it. We need a party of new type. A party of a new type that will practice democratic centralism. That's the kind of organization we need to actually take power in Russia. And it worked. Lenin, in 1903, he turned things around. He reoriented the Russian revolutionary movement. And in 1905, there was a huge uprising. And then in 1917, the working class was able to take power, turning things around, dramatically shifting. That is what precedes a revolution. It always has. Always has. Folks, I've got plenty of orange juice here tonight. But folks, this understanding that one can change, one can move in a different direction, one can turn things around rapidly, it's actually very big. It's a very big part of American culture. A very big part of American culture. You know, before the American Revolution, there was a mass movement in the United States that they called the Great Awakening. Now, it was a religious movement because at that point, that's how people generally understood politics. But it was a mass movement where all across the 13 colonies, I should say, you had ministers and clergymen going to people and reviving their faith, stirring them up with big speeches, pointing to parts of the Bible that talked about tyranny and injustice. And it was the awakening of the consciousness of the people of the 13 colonies that later laid the basis of the American Revolution. And before the Civil War, which was what Marxists referred to as the Second Great Awakening, right? The Second American Revolution. Before the Second American Revolution, you had the Second Great Awakening in the United States. You had ministers and pastors going around and stirring up their flocks and talking about the evils of slavery, and tent revival meetings being held, and you know, different new religious groups being formed, like the Seventh-day Adventists or the Mormons. A lot of American congregations can trace themselves back to the Second Great Awakening. There was an awakening in consciousness that expressed itself in terms of religion, again, because that's how American politics was at that time, where American people all throughout, you know, the United States, throughout the Midwest, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maine, New England, you had this revival of religious sentiment, urging opposition to slavery, urging that women have the right to vote. Many people don't realize that, but those tent revival pastors that preceded the Civil War were very, very in favor of women having the right to vote. And there was an awakening in consciousness that laid the basis for the Second American Revolution, the Civil War to abolish slavery. And interestingly, and this I find to be fascinating, is that the hymn, the song that was kind of the theme song of the Second Great Awakening. And I'm not going to sing for you. I don't sing on these lives. If I do it kind of tongue-in-cheek. But the theme song was the hymn that I'm sure you're all familiar with, or if you haven't been, that's okay. It was called Amazing Grace. It's still widely popular among religious groups and such in the United States. A hymn called Amazing Grace. And the hymn Amazing Grace, interestingly, itself was about this understanding that you can turn things around. Right? The story of how the song Amazing Grace was written. It was written by a slave trader. All right? This was a man who owned a boat. And he would go to Africa and take African people back to the United States to become slaves. And he had friends who were part of the Second Great Awakening. They were Christians. They were part of this mass anti-slavery religious revival movement that was going on across the United States. He didn't agree with them. Thought they were wrong. And the story is that the man who wrote the song Amazing Grace, he was on a boat. And that boat was on its way to Africa to take African people, put them in chains, bring them back to the United States in slavery. And that boat was hit by a storm. And he feared for his life. And as his boat was hit by the storm, it was in that moment that he decided to turn the slave ship around. He decided he was not going to participate in slavery. Right? It was about turning things around. And that became kind of symbolic for the United States because there was a feeling among people like John Brown, the abolitionist, among progressives, the early Marxist movement, that the United States was going in the wrong direction. It had seized Mexico to have more slave territory, more slave states like Texas. The United States, because of the plantation owners and the slave owners of the South, the rising power of bankers on Wall Street, the United States was moving in the wrong direction. And the rallying cry of the Second Great Awakening, this mass revival of religious movements in the United States, the rallying cry is we need to turn the ship around. We need to start going in the other direction. And yes, John Brown and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, they framed it in religious terms. But it was an understanding that we're going in one way. And if we keep going in this way, it's only going to get worse. We need to turn things around. We need to start moving in a new direction. We need innovation. We need to start doing things in a new way. And I would say, in the United States, we need to start doing things in a new way. We absolutely need to start doing things in a new way. Capitalism and the rule of profits, the rule of big bankers on Wall Street is leading us toward disaster. The global system of monopoly capitalism, imperialism, capitalism in its highest stage, is leading us toward disaster. Wages are dropping. Profits are being made from prisons, from opioids, from wars. It's unacceptable. We need to turn things around. We need to start moving in a new direction. And on the left, the organized political left, we also need to start moving in a new direction. We absolutely need to start moving in a new direction. Anti-populism, the idea that average Americans are our enemies, that needs to be gotten rid of. Right? The belief that drugs and drug use is somehow good. We should encourage people to get high, and that needs to be gotten rid of. Right? The rejection of science and dialectical materialism, that needs to be gotten rid of. We need to go back to the scientific roots of socialism, the idea that we're going to lead the masses of people to fight for their needs, to fight for justice. We're going to build solidarity. All right. Taiwan, writing it down. We're going... Okay. Prussians, 1848. The idea that we're going to somehow, reject the American people, look down on them. This needs to be gotten rid of. We need to be populist organizers. We need to see the masses of people as the heroes. We need to build solidarity, anti-racist solidarity, to show that racism is bad for all workers, to show that racism is the enemy of all working people, that we want to raise everyone up, starting with those who've been oppressed and faced discrimination their whole life, but really going to everyone. We want all living conditions. We want all of the American people's lives to improve. We want to change our relationship to the world. We need to change things on the left. We need to turn things around. We absolutely, desperately need to turn things around. Folks, you know, you never want to be too sure of anything in your life, right? I mean, let's be real, right? You never want to just blindly believe something. You want to be able to question things, right? You want to be open to possibly being wrong, right? That's just part of the way human beings are. But folks, the reality of the fact that socialism is superior to capitalism, I mean, it's so obvious that socialism is superior to capitalism. Folks, I've got The Economist here in front of me. Again, not a Marxist publication. But they're talking about two places that have been very, very, very effective in defeating the coronavirus. And they've actually done it very cost-effectively. Not only have they been effective in preventing infection of the coronavirus, but they've done it without spending huge amounts of money. And what places are they? They are Vietnam, aka the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and Kerala, the province of India, run by the Communist Party of India, Marxist. These two provinces have done so well in defeating the coronavirus. This is The Economist. Quote, Vietnam and Kerala both benefit from a long legacy of investment in public health, particularly in primary care, with strong centralized management, an institutional reach from city wards to remote villages, and an abundance of skilled personnel. No, not coincidentally, communism has a strong influence as the unchallenged ideology of Vietnam and as the brand touted by the leftist parties that have dominated Kerala since the 1950s. The two places that have the most cheaply and effectively worked against the coronavirus are places where Marxist-Leninists, tankies, not anarchids, not liberals, Marxist-Leninist tankies are in power. And this is from the mouth of some of the biggest enemies of socialism. You can't make this up, folks. I mean, look at Russian history. I mean, Russia became a superpower with socialism. It was with socialism that the country was industrialized, fully electrified, wiped out illiteracy. Furthermore, when Russia became capitalist in the 1990s, according to what you learned in school, in the 90s should have been the best time in Russia's history. When they privatized everything, they finally had freedom. The Yeltsin administration, Russia under free markets, under neoliberalism, under the IMF and the World Bank was a nightmare. They tried free market capitalism in the 90s, and it was a nightmare. And do you know how they solved it? You know how things got better? Do you know how Russia's economy was repaired? It was repaired because, starting in 1999, Putin nationalized oil and gas, right? He put the oil and gas under state control, and he re-centralized the economy around the state. So things got better in Russia when they moved away from free market capitalism. You can't make this up, folks. You can't make this up. All across Eastern Europe, right? There were many countries that were implementing free market reforms, and then the Communist Party was overthrown, right? In Romania, Czechoslovakia, Albania, East Germany, all these countries, all across Eastern Europe, Poland, all of them, capitalism was restored. And the result, mass poverty and suffering. And in China in the 1980s, they had market reforms. They significantly changed their socialist system. But they kept five-year plans. They kept the Communist Party in control. And now China is the second largest economy in the entire world. Right? 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. China has the world's largest hydroelectric power plant. It has the world's fastest supercomputers. It has, at this point, the world's biggest telecommunications manufacturers. Every day, another Chinese person becomes a millionaire because they reformed. Sure, they adopted market reforms, but they didn't overthrow socialism. They didn't return to capitalism. They turned things around. They didn't stick with the old Cold War model. They adjusted things from the Mao era. They turned things around, but they kept socialism. They remained true to socialism. They said poverty is not socialism, but to get rich is glorious. And now China is rising. Folks, it's very, 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 very obvious that socialism is superior to capitalism. It's very, very obvious that socialism is superior. I see that South Ossetia. Modern monetary theory. It's very, very obvious that socialism is superior to capitalism. Folks, if you want to be happy in life, you're going to need three things. Number one, you're going to need to be alive. Number two, you're going to need to have love in your life. And number three, you're going to need an ideal, something to believe in, a purpose. If you're not alive, if you don't have love in your life, you don't have an ideal, you're not going to be happy. But if you have those three things, you can be modestly happy. However, you'll notice that all three of those things that are necessary for human beings to be happy are things that you can't experience on your own. You can't be born without other people, right? I'm not going to give you a sex ed lecture. I think you all know what I'm talking about, right? Number two, you can't love all by yourself. You have to have an object to love. You have to love someone else. Someone else has to love you. In order to have love in your life, there has to be another person involved. Furthermore, a purpose or an ideal is also something that requires other people. It requires working with other people to achieve something. The basis of human happiness is collective. It's cooperation. It's working with other human beings. Human beings have always been collective. When we were hunter-gatherers in the woods for the majority of human history, to the times when we had the slave empires and built the pyramids and Rome and Greece, up into feudalism in Europe with those beautiful cathedrals that were built, up into modern-day capitalism. There is nothing in this world that anyone can say, I made that all by myself, right? Even the most, solitary wood carver is going to use tools that were made in a factory by hundreds of other workers. I'm looking at you right now. I'm talking to you right now over this broadcast. I'm looking into an iPhone that was manufactured by hundreds of other people, processed and shipped by hundreds of other people, sold to me by other workers. That human beings, everything we have as human beings is created collectively. We human beings are brilliant and amazing because of our ability to work together. We're not amazing and brilliant by ourselves. We're miserable by ourselves. Probably the worst thing about this pandemic is the fact that we're alone. The fact we're isolated. But when we human beings work together, we can make miracles happen. We can unleash creativity. We can do amazing, amazing things. But it requires collectivism. It requires group identity. It requires shared ideals. It requires love and human cooperation. Marx, Freud, Darwin, those are the three thinkers that really kind of defined modernity, right? The modern era. Sigmund Freud basically laid the basis of modern psychology. Charles Darwin laid the basis of modern biology, an understanding of human beings and the descent of man. And Karl Marx laid the basis for modern economics, right? They were all flawed in their own way, but they were all revolutionary. They all broke the rules. They all challenged the existing status quo. However, they were all wrong on one point. They were all of the viewpoint that human beings are animals, that human beings exist simply to avoid pleasure or to avoid pain and to seek pleasure. They thought human beings were just like dogs and cats and sheep and mice. And if they could understand human beings' biological urges, they could understand human beings. They did not comprehend that humanity had a spiritual side. They underestimated the selflessness of people, the ability of people to work for ideals, the ability of people to make sacrifices for higher principles and higher truths. We understand why they did that, because they were coming out of feudalism, right? The brave new world of capitalism had torn down feudalism, and in feudalism, people were taught to think purely in spiritual and religious terms. Religion was kind of the totalitarian method that feudal autocrats used to rule. So bringing in science and rationalism and thinking of human beings in biological terms was a breakthrough. It was revolutionary. They did a great job of changing the way we see human beings, but they went a little bit too far with it. Freud would have us believe that so much of our behavior is motivated simply by unconscious sexual urges. Darwin talks about survival of the fittest. He didn't actually use the phrase, from what I understand, but that's attributed to him. Marx writes a letter to Friedrich Engels and says, "Why do I exist? Right? This will all just naturally happen. Economic determinism. So why am I writing these books? Why am I doing this?" They were all a little bit too hard in their materialism. And it hurt their movement to some degree or other, because spirituality and passion and selflessness and courage, this is the basis of human civilization. Human beings are not animals. They do have a higher side. And if you don't appeal to that, and if you think of human beings in the way a zookeeper might think of the animals locked in cages, you're not going to be able to effectively organize them, right? We know that, right? That there was a coldness and a cold materialism that caused damage to the socialist movement. But we are now in the 21st century, and we see that being turned around. We see Xi Jinping in China and the Chinese dream, and how they are combining Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought with Confucianism and the brilliance of Chinese civilization. We see Bolivarian socialism in Latin America, where they're largely influenced by religion and the teachings of Jesus Christ, and mass religious movements, religious communes like I visited in Caracas. So things are changing. Right? And socialism is adjusting for our time. And it should always be in a state of adjustment. We should always be willing to turn around and change things. And I just want to end my opening remarks here before I start doing the roll call and taking all your questions by telling a brief personal story. Now, some of you may have heard this story already, but some of you have not. So I'll just tell this story. When I was 15 years old, my parents allowed me to spend a Saturday afternoon at a communist bookstore. And so I went from my little town in Ohio all the way up to Cleveland, and I went to Cleveland Heights, Coventry area, and I went to a Marxist bookstore. And of course, that was like amazing for me to be able to be at a Marxist bookstore where they had the writings of Marx and Lenin and Mao and stuff like that on the wall, and books about Marxism was like amazing to me. But I will never forget something that happened when I was 15 years old. It was a life-changing moment when some other communists, they patted 15-year-old me on the back, and they said, "We're going to go sell the paper." They handed me a stack of communist newspapers, and they said, "We are going to go sell the newspaper." And I must tell you, I looked at them, I was scared shitless. I said, "Wait a second, you want me to go out and go to people I don't know, people who might not agree with communism, people I've never met before, walk up to them randomly and try to sell them a newspaper about communism? Are you out of your mind?" And they said, "Nope, we do this all the time." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't do this." They said, "Nope, you got to do it." And I said, "Well, can I just give it to them if they don't?" No, got to get $1. It wasn't the people's world, unfortunately. Got to get $1. So I went out on the corner in Coventry, Coventry, Cleveland Heights, Ohio. I walked up to people. You want an article on socialism? We got like a socialist paper. It's a newspaper that's really, really against George Bush. Do you want to get a copy? I was very, very nervous, extremely nervous. I was not comfortable doing that. And part of the reason I was uncomfortable is because my family had been particularly angry with me for being a communist and had urged me to stop expressing my views. At school, I would raise my hand in social studies classes and argue about communism. And my family had urged me to stop doing that. They said, you're bringing a bad reputation to our family. You're embarrassing our family. Don't argue with communism. Don't be seen with Marxist books. You're embarrassing us. And I was being taught to be ashamed of my communist politics. And so being told that I should go out and talk to these people was the opposite of the message I was getting in my parents' household, from my brother, from other people. No. I was an embarrassment. Only idiots would believe in communism. Everyone knows capitalism is the only way, and if you go out and express the view that you're a communist, you look like a fool. I was constantly being given this negative feedback. But they told me to go out and sell that newspaper. And you know what? I sold one newspaper, and I sold another newspaper. I remember that day, I sold a newspaper to a guy, and I was wearing my Letterman's jacket because I had played sports in high school. I played soccer and whatever, so I was wearing my Letterman's jacket. And a guy saw the O on my jacket, for Orville, which is my hometown in Ohio. And he said, well, you know what, young man, I'll buy your newspaper because you go to Oberlin College, right? I see that O. I didn't go to Oberlin. I said, okay, and sold him the newspaper anyway. And it was a beautiful experience. I learned that day when I was 15, through the process of overcoming that fear and overcoming that nervousness, that I was damn good at selling newspapers. In fact, I read so much about communism, I'd argued with people so much about communism, I was pretty good at it. When people said, communism's evil, I had an answer. And it was such a beautiful, empowering experience. I didn't have to be ashamed of who I was. This was something I knew about. This was something I understood. This is something I could be proud of. I never stopped. I haven't stopped. And that's the thing. I keep going, folks. People all thought when I was finding my way out of a certain political organization that I was done. They said, okay, Caleb's just going to go back to living a normal life. No. I'm not done. Because, folks, communism, socialism is what gives me life energy. It's what keeps me going in this world so full of pain and suffering. I told you this story once before, but I'll tell it to you again. If you're on a ship in the ocean, Huey Long remembers selling his first paper. Good. If you're on a ship in the ocean and you don't want to get seasick, you have to keep your eye on the horizon. Right? The ship is moving around, it's shaking, but there's one thing that is steady, that's constant, that's unmoving. And that is the horizon. And socialism and Marxism is my horizon. It is my reason to keep going. And it can be your horizon too. It's the only hope we have in this time. The only way we can get out of this crisis. And now is the time to ask yourself. I'm not going to ask it of you. Just ask yourself this question. What have I done for the revolution? What have I done for socialism? What have I done for Marxism? How can I make a greater effort to get us out of this nightmare? What can I do? Can I get more involved in the effort to build the Center for Political Innovation? Can I give a donation? Can I distribute socialist and Marxist books in my area? What can I do to make a better contribution to the revolution? What can I do to get us out of this nightmare? What can I do to point to the way out of this disaster? What can I do? I challenge you this coming week, it's Monday night, but this coming week, to ask yourself, what can I do? What can I do to build socialism? Because I can tell you the truth, folks. I told you there are three things you need in your life to be happy. Life itself, love, and an ideal. And socialism is a true ideal. And if you want to be happy, if you want to feel fulfilled, You need to find an ideal to live for. You need to have truth to believe in. Socialism can be your horizon. There is a way out of the nightmare of capitalism. And on that note, I am going to take a drink. And folks, I will now do that thing. Now that I'm done with that great, that introductory remark, I am now going to do that thing where I call you out as I see you. Let's see who's here. But before we do that, remember to tweet this out. Remember to hit the like button. Remember to hit the subscribe button. Remember to hit the bell. Remember to post this on Facebook. Post this in your favorite Reddit subcategory or whatever they're called, subreddit. And now is the time to give me your names and locations. The first person I see is Robert from Texas. Who else is there? Who else is with us? All right. Who else is here? Mike from Phoenix is with us. Who else is with us today? Who else is with us? Who else is joining this lovely conversation? Lawrence Chu in Albany. Adi in Bed-Stuy, Dust James in Savannah, Georgia, Tyler Woodby in Lee County, Florida, Max Henson from Boston, Will DeMarco from PA, Lexington, Kentucky, Atlanta, Toronto, David from Italy, John from Charlotte, North Carolina, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Ohio, Raleigh once again in Maryland, Long Island, Stanley Stanlin in Long Island, Kaname in Maryland, Brian Schaefer in Illinois, Voltaire from the solar system, RB from Culver City, Jay from Philadelphia, Leo from Winnipeg, Manitoba, No Orbit Class War from West Virginia, Cleveland, Pirate Alex, England, Australia. Wow, they're going by fast. Repeat if I don't read you because they're going by way fast. Huey Long from New Orleans, Jack Dundee from the UK, Queens, New York, Nicholas Ramos, Alex Giovanni from Salem, Oregon, Leftism Today from Riverside, California. Who is with us? Ron from St. George, Utah, UK, Bay Area, non-user, David Luan in Milwaukee, Sarantos in Seattle, Kevin Q from Ohio, Dylan from Worcester, Nick Lynch, James from Connecticut, Jakarta, Indonesia, Mr. Red, Mark from California, Turlock, California, Peter Cushing, Small Town, Missouri, Atlanta, Egypt, CL from Atlanta, Tommy Faraz from the Gold State, Enrique from Newark, New Jersey, Riverside, CA, Justin Rivera, right? Who else is with us? Who else is with us? They go by so fast, and then they don't go by. Brisbane, Australia, Simon Wood. Panoma, California, Mi Menman. Chile, Robbie from Chile. Who else is here? Bogota, Colombia, Alejandro. Upper West Side of New York, Truth Seeker. Who else is with us? Right? Cyprus, Greece. Wow. Comrade from Iran is with us. Default from Atlanta is with us. Who else is here? Sami from the UK, Chuck from Utah, Dylan Small is with us. Wow. Wow. Who else is here, folks? Names and locations. Guy from Miami, Florida. Guy from Miami, Florida. What a night. Wilmington, California. Toronto, Canada. Mosen. Right? Irwin from Los Angeles. Southern Indiana, Della Torre. Right? FVK from Memphis. FVK from Memphis. Right? Who else is with us? Who did I miss? Got the motorcycles outside. So damn annoying. So damn annoying. I'm watching names go by. Any other names and locations for me to call out before I jump into these super chats? I've got quite a bit of super chats to read. Nate from Sydney, Australia. Dante from Southern California. Okay. Alrighty. Anybody else? Richie from Staten Island. Sam Fresh. Memphis, Tennessee. Thaddeus. Bird from Thailand. Matthew from Illinois. Meadows. All righty. All righty, folks. Dallas, Texas, split seconds. Ithaca, New York, Michael Ristorucci. I'm so sorry. I don't want to butcher your name. Michael from Ithaca, New York. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, folks. All righty. So, labor theory of value is Denver, Colorado, baby, from FTW all day. Labor theory of value. For apparently the last live, someone did ask about the labor theory of value, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, and that happens every so often, if I miss your super chat, don't be afraid to leave me a comment or send me a message reminding me, and I will get to it, right? I don't want anyone to not get their super chat answered. I'm trying to get you in a position where you'll stay still, right? Here we go. Better? Better? Why does it keep falling over? Right, there we go. Now, so someone asked about labor theory of value, and I didn't get to it last time, and I see someone's asked about it tonight, so yes, I will get to it. The labor theory of value is the idea that labor is the source of all wealth. And Marx actually argued that it was labor and nature that was the source of all wealth. In his critique of the Goethe program, it was put forward in the Goethe program, an early social democratic party platform in Germany, that labor creates all wealth. And Marx said, well, technically labor and nature, right, natural resources create all wealth. But it's the idea that wealth and value is created by labor, and thus, because labor creates the wealth, the capitalists, the employers, the profits that they make are the exploitation of the worker. Right? That the worker is not being paid the full value of his labor so that the capitalist can make a profit. So this is the basis of exploitation. It takes place because the worker is not paid the full value of what he produces. And the way for that to be ultimately resolved would be with the elimination of capitalism and the rise of communism, right? The ultimate goal of communism would mean that the worker, receives from society the same value as what he puts into it. And that it was actually, interestingly, the labor theory of value is not, unique to Marxism. Adam Smith believed in the labor theory of value, right? There was a pope, a Catholic pope, before Adam Smith, who said that human labor creates all wealth. And you can go down the line. So, it is an essential part of Marxism. If you read Theories of Surplus Value by Karl Marx, he goes into great detail criticizing the physiocrats and Ricardo and Malthus and other economists. Good stuff. I recommend Theories of Surplus Value, which is published after Marx's death. It's a compilation put together by Karl Kautsky. 3 volumes of Marx criticizing other economists, criticizing them for the fact that they either don't accept the labor theory of value or try to explain it in different ways. Marx, more than any other economist, studied other economists. He studied what was there. He was in the British Museum all the time studying other economists, making statistical, deductions and determining the basis for it. And there you go. Yeah, that's the labor theory of value. I hope that answers the question that was asked before and repeated tonight. There you go. Someone was asked about my family being Democrats. Well, my goodness, what is wrong with this tripod? All right, so someone was asked about my family being Democrats. I don't want to say too much about my family, and you don't do that, right? Your relationship with your family isn't based on what political party that they are in. But let me just say that for me to be who I am today has required me to make a lot of great sacrifices. I'll just be real about that. My family did not approve of a lot of the choices I made in life that got me where I am today. And in a lot of ways, I would say my family greatly underestimated me and what I'm capable of. They did not think highly of me. They did not think I had great potential, and they were wrong. And we keep going. We keep building this movement. We can't expect people to think highly of political movements like this. We can't expect people to believe that socialism is the answer when they've been told right-wing things all their lives. We just have to struggle with people, right? And I'll tell you, my relationship with my family, like your relationship with your family, shouldn't be about politics, right? You don't want to love your family because you want to recruit them to a political group, and that family relations are a hard thing. I mean, Marx in his writing talks a lot about how the family is reduced to being a mere financial relationship, how callous cash payment has reduced the connections people have with each other, right? There's a lot of pain in people's lives. I know a lot of people who their family life hasn't been what they want it to be. They have pain about their relationship with their family. They have pain about their relationship with their mother or their sister or their brother. They have pain about their relationship. And it's a very common condition, right? The family structure and the way people are alienated from each other and the way rivalries develop, the way people learn to be competitive and how they look, the way people become judgmental. One phenomenon that many people have observed is that it seems like many families actually pick somebody in the family to be like a scapegoat. No kidding. It's a very common trend, that you'll have a household, a parent, mother, a father, and multiple kids, and they'll pick one of the kids who's overweight or nerdy or whatever, and they'll become the scapegoat, the blame for all the family's problems. Very common occurrence, right? It happens in a lot of families, and a lot of times those people have a lot of pain in their lives because they experience that. And I have met so many people who have become great socialists and revolutionaries who that is their story. They became the scapegoat in their family, and that pain drove them to look for something, to find that connection elsewhere. It's very, very beautiful, but it's very, very sad at the same time that people are reduced to that, right? That families, in order to maintain order, in order to deal with the problems of the household, in order to try and make sense of the world, they scapegoat one member of their family. Very, very problematic practice, but it's just a thing that people do. I'm sure they don't do it intentionally. It just develops that way. People have noted that that's a lot of urban culture, right? For example, the gay movement, New York City was kind of the center. New York City and San Francisco were centers of the gay movement. A lot of times because these gay people would feel rejected by their family. They would feel like the family would all think they're crazy, would be ashamed of them for being gay. So they would go to a city to try and find something new, to try and find a new family or a new community to be part of. And that's part of urban culture historically, right? Urban centers tend to be people who, they tend to attract people who are from other places. Who maybe they just didn't fit in. Maybe they just didn't belong. They felt they were looking for something deeper. They were looking for something more meaningful in life. So I hope that answers your question, Sami Ali. I continuously get asked about the shining path. Now I have answered this question on the last live. I answered it on the live before that. I'm telling you, I will repeat what I have said. I don't think highly of the shining path. There was a peasantry in Peru that was suffering a lot. They did a lot to fight for the peasantry, but they had a sectarian and violent approach toward other leftists. They bombed the Chinese embassy. They assassinated other leftist groups. They could not make alliances. They engaged in brutal killings. And I'm glad they fought for the rights of peasants. That's something. But I don't have a lot of respect for them. I view them as an ultra-left group. And the fact that all that it took to end their revolution was arresting Gonzalo, right? And all the leaders captured, revolution over. That doesn't make me think very highly of them. And I'll tell you, when I've gone to international communist gatherings and when I meet with communists from Peru, every communist I've ever met from Peru hates the shining path and speaks of them as, they'll maintain their CIA agents and stuff like that. I don't maintain that. I don't think they're CIA agents. I think they're an ultra-leftist group. But I'm telling you, communists in Peru don't like the shining path, right? The shining path, very hostile, very, hostile to Cuba, very hostile to other communist groups in Peru. Not a big fan. Not a big fan. That said, the Fujimori dictatorship that they fought against, which came into power mainly because of panic, because of the shining path, was pretty brutal and awful. And the United States backed up a brutal military junta in Peru that brutally tortured people and did horrendous things. And that you can put the shining path, right? You can put the shining path in the same category as the Caracazo in Venezuela, as the Waco incident in the United States, David Koresh. You can put it in the same category as the Move House bombing in Philadelphia. That in that period where socialism was in decline, right? Late 80s, early 90s, You had kind of a rise of different kind of utopian groups, that organized oppressed people, right? And that the Move House bombing, right? That was a Move organization. I've interviewed Ramona Africa. I've interviewed Pam Africa. They very much are a spiritual organization. They're utopians. They're environmentalists. They protested against the zoo in Philadelphia. They didn't deserve to be treated the way they were, to have to be that bombing. I mean, it was unbelievably unjustified, right? The same with, David Koresh, right? I mean, and the people in Waco. I mean, okay, were they a group that was doing some things, abusing children and maybe operating in a way that was problematic? Sure, but did they deserve to be blown up like that, to kill a compound full of people, 76 people killed? Of course not. But when Marxism was in retreat, when the Marxist movement was in retreat, you had a rise of kind of utopian groups of some kind or other, be it religious utopian. And I put the Shining Path in the same category. They called themselves Maoists and Marxists, but if you look at their literature, they were very much a utopian organization. It was, the Shining Path of Presidente Gonzalo, and the beheadings and the executing dogs, and yeah, I'm just not digging it. And the same for the Naxals in India. I'm not a big fan. This is an ultra-left deviation. This is something that if Mao were alive, he wouldn't approve of. This was, people that were trying to carry out Maoism. And you look at, like, in Nepal, the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, they succeeded. Right? They're a major party in Nepal. They're working, but they changed. In order to succeed, they had to break with that lunatic politics. The Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, right? The the United Communist Party of Nepal. They support Xi Jinping. They are very close to the Bolivarian countries. They're working with the Belt and Road from China. They started out as one of those Shining Path ultra-left groups, But as they liberated territory in the countryside, as the king was forced to step down and there was more political space in Nepal, they changed, right? They did what the communists of Latin America did, right? When they were no longer forced to operate in the countrysides, they were able to operate in the cities, and they changed, and they actually got a lot more done. So I would point to that, right? And that there are other groups from that tradition around the world that come out of that ultra-Maoist current. But some of them, the ones that are successful, Nicholas Ramos is talking about Mao on Contradictions, written down. The ones that are successful are ones that have broken with that mindset, have stopped being ultra-left, have joined coalitions, and started to get things done. And the ones that don't remain kind of isolated. The Naxals in India, have they made any progress in the last 10 years, 20 years? No. They're kind of isolated. They rob people in the mountains, But, Communist Party of Nepal Maoist came from that tradition of the Gang of Four ultra-Maoism, but they changed, right? Shining Path, have they done anything? Well, Gonzalo got captured, game over. There's still there's probably still some group somewhere up in the hills, but there you go. I don't have a high opinion of the Shining Path at all. I just don't. Bombing the Cuban embassy, bombing the Chinese embassy, violence against other communist groups, hostility to organized labor in the Peruvian cities. I just can't admire that. I guess I admire the fact that they lifted up peasants, that they organized peasants to fight for their land. So, they obviously helped a lot of people. At the same time, they did bad things, but not a big fan. Not a big fan. I hope you don't ask me about that again, because I'll just tell you the same thing. All right. China and artificial intelligence, right? So China has made big use of artificial intelligence. I'm going to take another drink of this orange juice. China has made a big use of artificial intelligence, right? A lot of what is published about their social credit system is not accurate. It's just not accurate. For example, most of the people who get screwed by the social credit system have been convicted in court. They've gone into a court of law. They've been sued by somebody. They owe money to the government, and the government is unable to collect, right? And so what do? How do they collect? Well, they don't let you book a flight until you pay what you owe, right? In the United States, if the government fines you money and you don't pay it, you can go to jail. Well, in China, They don't have that mechanism. So if you have been sued, or if you lose in court and are forced to pay a fine and you don't pay it, they don't let you book a flight. They make it sound like somebody tweets critically of the government and then they never can get on a plane again, and that's not accurate. But that's not to say that they applied the social credit system differently in different areas. It was first applied in some areas, first applied in other areas, and that some of the ways they applied it in local areas were a little bit problematic, and they adjusted it. But a lot of what we're reading about the social credit system in American media is not accurate. And there's articles from the Washington Post that confirm that. This is widely understood that the characterization of social credit in American media, it's like cameras watching everyone all at once, and if you say one critical thing, you're dragged away in the middle. That's not accurate. Not accurate. And actually, they've talked about how the Chinese government, and this is in articles, in mainstream U.S. media, they talk about how, in a way, the social credit system and use of social media in China has helped the Chinese Communist Party to combat corruption in the local area. If people in an area are all mad about, the traffic lights not working, they all get on the internet and they get on WeChat and they post about it, and then other people see it, and then the central government steps in and tells that local official to get that damn, stoplight fixed. So in a way, it actually helps the Chinese Communist Party be more responsive to the people and listen to the people's concerns. Not to say that nothing bad is going on. I don't think China's a paradise. I think China is a socialist country that's had many successes, also has many problems. And if you're looking for somebody to be a blind apologist for China or any other socialist country, you're talking to the wrong guy. I think we should learn from what China's done right. We can be critical and learn from what China's done wrong as we try to develop socialism in our own way. And that needs to be understood. Yeah. I'm supposed to debate this Vosh character, and I'm sure he's going to try to, what do you think? Want more connection to the outside world? Okay, Hong Kong. All right. We'll talk about Hong Kong. Hong Kong. So, I'm going to debate this Vosh character. It's starting to look like it's going to happen. He didn't reply to my post, but then he did reply to my post. So if it happens, I'm sure he's going to try to corner me and get me to, say something, and I'm not going to allow him to do that. So, there you go. All righty. 1848 revolution in France. Well, in 1848, there were revolutions all across Europe. All across Europe, you had revolutions that happened everywhere. I believe there were more than 200 different uprisings in Europe in 1848. They called it the Spring of Nations, and the main demand was for modern nation states with democratic republics. In fact, the people in France, Germany, Britain, all of these places, all across Europe, all these places that were rising up and fighting for their rights and uprisings. All these people in the 1848 revolutions, a lot of them were referred to as Republicans, interestingly. And in fact, the Republicans of Germany, the ones that were socialists, they called the Red Republicans, right? It's very fascinating. But there you go. In France, they had an uprising, right? Just like in all the other European countries. And most of these revolutions failed. The German Revolution of 1848 failed, right? And Marx was part of the German Revolution of 1848, which failed. Spent most of his life in London because of the failed revolution. Couldn't go back to Germany. That's the roots of the Marxist movement. Socialists and communists wanting people to vote for Biden. All right. That's the origins of Marxism. Marxism originated within the 1848 revolutions. The Communist Manifesto, now called 1960s, the Communist Manifesto was written in 1848 to represent the Communist League, which was a group in Germany that participated in the 1848 uprising. So that Spring of Nations, those uprisings that happened in Europe in 1848, those are essential to Marxism's birth. But Marxism has learned a lot since then. It's not the same movement. So there you go. Okay, I don't know about Black September 1970. I don't know what that refers to. So I wish I could give you an answer there, but thank you. Can't give you the answer you're looking for. I'll have to Google that one. You stumped me. I sometimes I see these posts on here and people are like, I want to ask you about, and you stumped me. But Liu Shaoqi, we can talk about that. Liu Shaoqi. Alrighty. Okay. So the Iranian fuel tankers en route to Venezuela. I don't get this. So the United States wages economic warfare against Iran, right? Iran makes a nuclear deal to get the sanctions to go away. Trump gets in there, rips up that nuclear deal. Every time Iran tries to test their missile system so they can deter Israeli attack, so they can have an effective missile system to deflect Israeli attack, every time they do that, they get more sanctions slapped on them. The USA has gone out of its way to economically isolate the Islamic Republic of Iran, to just come down so hard on them. The USA has done the same thing to Venezuela. Sanctions imposed on them. Just lately, there was just a military coup attempt against the Venezuelan government. So Venezuela also faces all of this. And, this happens, and now Venezuela and Iran are trading with each other. Why are you surprised by that? These are two oil-producing states led by revolutionary governments that are opposed to Western capitalism, that are being viciously targeted by the United States. Both have tried to negotiate. Remember Hugo Chavez giving a book to Obama, Open Veins of Latin America, and tried to negotiate, negotiate and soft power and all of that, and instead have gotten screwed. We have the USA trying to violently overthrow their governments, economically isolating them. And so these two countries that have been targeted, one of them is a Marxist government led by Roman Catholic Marxists and Bolivarians. The other is an Islamic revolutionary Shia government. Both of them have been attacked by the United States, and so they're trading with each other. What's the big deal here? Why is anyone at all surprised by that? And on what grounds does the United States have to step in and try and stop them? All right. On what grounds? On what grounds does the United States have to intervene in that, right? Can you talk about the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia? That I can absolutely talk about. That we can talk a lot about. Yugoslavia. All right. So, yeah, the United States has no right to intervene. Taiwan, I was asked about Taiwan and China. Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan has always been part of China. The United States government started recognizing that. The KMT ruling party recognizes that. And, perhaps, there are people with different traditions and their autonomy should be recognized. But Taiwan is part of China. It will always be part of China. And the attempt to say that Taiwan is an independent country, right, which is not what one of the major parties, in Taiwan thinks. The KMT does not think Taiwan's a separate country. Right? It's not what people in China think. It is not a separate country. Taiwan is part of China. Tibet is part of China. The Uyghur regions are part of China. Hong Kong is part of China. And trying to break apart China is a long-time plan of U.S. imperialism. And that's unacceptable, right? Not feeling it. Not feeling it. After the 1949 revolution, the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek, they fled to Taiwan. And for a long time, in the United Nations, this little island of Taiwan represented all of China in the UN, the Republic of China on Taiwan, the government on Taiwan, as Obama called it, represented the entire 1/4 of humanity on the Chinese mainland. That's ridiculous. That's an insult. And the government on Taiwan was rigged in a lot of ways because it had seats in the parliament representing all of China. So the local population, their ability to be represented in the government, they were always outruled by all these people representing provinces on the mainland. It's a joke. And the fact, the Soviet Union for a long time demanded that China's seat on the UN Security Council belonged to the People's Republic of China. And it was a big struggle for decades. It was decades of struggle by the Soviet Union, by other countries, to get China on the UN Security Council. And it was a big struggle because for a long time, Taiwan, right, the Republic of China, the government on Taiwan, was claiming it was part of the it was representative of the entire mainland, right? For a long time, Taiwan claimed it was a representative of the entire mainland. So, yeah, I'm just, that's ridiculous. So now that they're no longer representative of the entire mainland, now we're our own country. Now, one country, two systems, the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party have come to an understanding. They recognize and respect each other. And so you now have the rise of these virulent anti-China, anti-mainland separatist groups, the DPP, and all of that. And those are groups that are trying to line up with anti-Chinese fanatics. Many suspect that the United States is heavily involved, and it's not a good thing, right? There is one China. There is one China. That's been the U.S. government's policies. Leftists in Iran. Okay. That's been the U.S. government's policies from day one, or not from day one, but since things have changed, right? Henry Kissinger, changed that, and Nixon and going to China, and eventually Jimmy Carter recognizing China, yeah, that's all there is to it. One China, and stop trying to tear apart China. Alrighty. All right. The Prussians in 1848. That's interesting because, I grew up in Ohio, right? And I'm an Irish American. I have a French last name because my ancestors were Huguenots. So they were people who, fled France to Ireland. So that's why, as an Irish person of Protestant heritage, I have a French last name. But I grew up around lots of people with German last names. My first grade teacher was Mrs. Wenger. My second grade teacher was Mrs. Schumacher. My kindergarten teacher was Mrs. Hartman. My fourth grade teacher was Mr. Hurst. Right? My fifth grade teacher was Miss Hines. My sixth grade teacher was Miss Pricing. Lots of Germans I grew up around. I was in Ohio in a rural area, and there were even some of these old German religions, like Mennonitism was very big among the people I grew up around. Mennonites, we would see Amish people. They went to separate schools. They didn't speak English. They spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. We saw Amish people. They were around. You'd see a buggy go by every so often. There were apostolics. There were Church of the Brethren members. And these were all 48ers. The folks that I went to school with German last names, most of whom they were people whose ancestors had moved to Ohio in 1848. In 1848, you had the attempted German Revolution. And some of the most radical people in it were these fanatical Protestant sects. Bet you didn't know that. But yeah, the 1848 Revolution, it was the peasantry of Germany and the workers of Germany rising up and demanding a German nation state. Right? There were a bunch of principalities and local feudal governments. They wanted a modern nation state. And what was the anthem of the revolution in 1848? What do you think it was? Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. Which is, now that's an anthem people associate with Nazism and stuff like that. But that was the anthem of the 1848 revolution because they were fighting, it was progressive. They were fighting for a nation state, which would be a democratic republic, which would, sweep away the power of these local, these local autocrats, right? That was the 1848 revolution. And it wasn't just religious fanatics who fled from Germany in 1848. I grew up around people whose ancestors had been Mennonites and Brethrens and whatever. And they were all descended from what you call the Anabaptists, right? Anabaptists, that was the fanatical sects in Germany. They didn't believe in infant baptism, right? Most Christians believe that the baby is baptized when it's born, but there were these radical religious people in Germany who felt like you should baptize people when they get to be 14, or when they're 8 or 9 or whatever, right? You don't baptize babies, you baptize people when they reach a certain age. And those folks, they didn't like the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church believed in infant baptism, but the main reason was the Catholic Church was feudalism. And a lot of the Protestants, like the Lutherans and others, were in bed with feudalism. And the Anabaptists were some of the most radical people in Germany. But you also had Marxists, and August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer, two Germans who fled Germany after the 1848 revolution failed, Marx went to London, but August Willich and Joseph Weydemeyer and hundreds of other people that were communists. They were part of Karl Marx's Communist League, and they fled Germany, and they moved to Ohio and Pennsylvania and all across the United States, and they actually laid the basis of modern Marxism. You know, the German Americans were the first Marxists in the United States, and actually, if you go way back, you go back to the 1840s, 1850s, just like now, or just like, you know, people, you know, in the 1920s and 30s thought communism was for Jewish people, just like, you know, in the 1970s, people associated radical politics with black people. Well, you go back to the 1840s, communism and Marxism and radical politics was associated with Germans. Bet you didn't know that, but German Americans faced discrimination, and the stereotype of a German American was that a German American would be a fanatical, communist radical, or a religious fanatic, which again, the world changes, but in 1848, the religious fanatical Germans and the communist Germans were on the same side against the Catholic Germans and against the status quo. That doesn't make sense now. You think of religious fanatics and Marxists being on opposite sides, but history has a weird way of working itself out. And yes, the Red 48ers, they were called. Those are Germans who came to the United States in 1848. They formed a Marxist battalion, a Marxist regiment in the American Civil War called Die Neuner, or the Ohio 9th Regiment, the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. And it was led by Joseph Weydemeyer, who was a Marxist. And they waved a red flag in the battlefield during the American Civil War. And they guarded St. Louis, Missouri. And they fought on the battlefields of Missouri during the American Civil War. I bet you didn't know that. But yes, and August Willich, who was a German-American immigrant, who was a friend of Karl Marx, he even rose to the rank of brigadier general in the Union Army. They made him a general in the Army, you know, because he was such a good military leader, and he was a German Marxist. And yes, there was, you know, the American Civil War, folks. People don't realize that the American Civil War was a revolution, right? It was slavery, which was the social system of half the United States at that time, the slave plantation system, backed up by Wall Street, backed up by the British Empire, and it was smashed. They broke apart the slave system. They broke slavery. And in order to do it, Abraham Lincoln had to build a huge popular front, a huge coalition, right? The Republican Party, when it was formed, they took their name from 1848, from all those revolutions in Europe were led by Republicans fighting for a republic, like the Germans, the French, whatever. They were the Republican Party, and Abraham Lincoln was a populist, right? He was from Illinois, which at that point was the Wild West of the United States. He was from Illinois. He was this tall lawyer with a deep voice from Illinois, right? And he was known for courageous deeds in courtrooms, like, you know, like helping women that were domestic violence victims and sticking up for poor people who were being arrested for stealing food. And he was a populist from Illinois. And he, you know, the Republican Party, when it started, the slogan was free land, free labor, free men. Free land, free labor, free men. They were the party of the trade unions. They were the party of the small farmers, who they called the free soilers, who didn't believe in slavery. They were for independent small farmers. They were the party of capitalists, of industrial capitalists. You read, I mean, you know, Abraham Lincoln, yes, problematic in many ways by our standards, but you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it comes across this man is a populist, right? He says, thank God we live in a country where men have the right to go on strike. He condemns capitalists. He says the capitalists generally come together to fleece the people, right? He's a populist. He is an organizer, and they write songs about him, Lincoln and Liberty too. They have another song about Lincoln that they, you know, old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness. You know, he was seen as a people's man. When he got elected, he didn't even want to end slavery. That was the wild thing. He just wanted to stop slavery's power. The slave plantation owners were out of control. They were maintaining not only that they had slavery, but that the whole rest of the country had to cooperate with slavery. They were, you know, they had, you know, the fugitive slave law. That, you know, if you're in a state that doesn't believe in slavery and a slave runs away, the government of that state has to cooperate with slavery and arrest the slave and take them back to the other state. Well, the rest of the country said, no, we don't want to do that. But, Supreme Court, we know about, Dred Scott and all of that. The Supreme Court was forcing the rest of the country. Furthermore, new states were coming into the country, right? New territories were coming in. And most of the country wanted those states to not be slave states. But the plantation owners and Wall Street and the British Empire were trying to make Texas and Kansas and states like that into slave states. So the new territories, they wanted to be new slave territories. Well, Lincoln came in as just kind of an uprising of the labor unions, of the religious abolitionist movement, of the small farmers, all kinds of people, against the slaveholders controlling the American government. They said, we are going to drive the slaveholders out of the American government. It was an anti-monopoly coalition. It was an anti-monopoly coalition against slavery and the big bankers and the British Empire. That's what it was an anti-monopoly government. And of course, what happened? Immediately after Lincoln took office, they took up arms and tried to violently overthrow the government. So Lincoln was forced to build a coalition to beat back the slaveholders. And that coalition was broad and beautiful. Harriet Tubman became the first woman to lead soldiers into battle. And along the Combahee River in South Carolina, Harriet Tubman led soldiers to free African-American slaves and to kill the slave owners and free the slaves from plantation to plantation. Harriet Tubman was a military leader, the first woman to ever lead American soldiers into battle. You had Frederick Douglass, right, who was going to the White House to meet with Abraham Lincoln, right? You had the Ohio 9th Regiment, the Marxist division of the Union Army. The Civil War was an explosion of popular power, of democratic upsurge. And afterwards, Reconstruction. Read W.E.B. Du Bois' book on Reconstruction. Because after the Civil War, there was a huge, huge effort to try and to essentially try and reconstruct the United States, to reconstruct the South, to provide public education to low-income people, to divide up the land of slave owners, and Reconstruction was defeated, and the troops were pulled out of the South. It was a huge disaster. Jim Crow segregation came into existence because Reconstruction was defeated, and so. You read about that. W.E.B. Du Bois has an amazing, amazing book called Black Reconstruction, which is a history of the American Civil War and a history of the Reconstruction afterwards. You don't know how progressive. The moment after the Civil War, when land was being redistributed, when public education was being created, white and black workers were standing arm in arm. There was some really amazing progressive stuff that happened in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it was broken apart by Wall Street and imperialism. And the Republican Party basically stabbed it in the back. There was a compromise, and it was awful. But you wouldn't know that if you study American history the way it's generally taught. The way American history is generally taught, you get this Gone with the Wind narrative, that the South was the victim somehow. But actually, you really ought to see the movie Free State of Jones. That's a really good movie. It's pretty violent, pretty bloody, but it's a good movie about the American Civil War and what happened. All right, enough about that. I haven't followed the current situation in South Ossetia. Thank you for asking me about it. I will look into it. I haven't followed it. I just haven't. Sorry. I hope that's not, I know it's not the answer you wanted, but I don't know enough about it. Modern monetary theory. I'm not too impressed with it, honestly. It's popular now in radical circles. The idea that, there's stuff about the government can just print money and inflation, and I don't understand it as much as I should, so I should probably do a thorough investigation before I give you any analysis. But from what it looks like to me, not a big fan. The problem, I'm not a fan of the Federal Reserve. And I ultimately believe that it should be the federal government of the United States that prints money, not a private corporation like the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is a ripoff. It's a ripoff system. So where the bankers basically, get money. And they've turned the government into a giant ATM where they just get more money, right? They lend us money, we print money, they get debt. We get in debt by printing money. It's a ripoff. The Federal Reserve System is a ripoff. Absolutely a ripoff. So there you go. All right. All right. Mao on contradiction. That's a very important essay that Mao wrote about the Marxist concept of contradiction, right? And how there is a primary contradiction and a secondary contradiction, about class struggle. I recommend it. It's a very good essay. Very good essay. I encourage people to read it. It's very important on understanding the Marxist method and how to understand the world. It's a good essay. I mean, I don't know what more I can say about it. It's essential in understanding Marxism. So, alrighty. I'm gonna need another pen. This pen is dying. Where's the other pen? Oh, where is the other pen? I'm gonna need another one. Alrighty. I have another pen around here somewhere. Oh boy. Oh bother. Oh bother. Oh well. Okay. All right. Mao on contradiction. Oh, it's still got some ink in it. All right. Cool. Hong Kong connections. Well, the issue in Hong Kong in the protest is not that they want a better connection with the outside world. That's not the issue in the protests. The issue in the protests is that the protesters want to be able to break the law on the Chinese mainland and be exempt from facing the legal system on the Chinese mainland. They don't want to be extradited. That's the issue in the protest. They don't want to be extradited. Sami, I didn't know about 1970. I couldn't give you an answer. You didn't miss the answer because I just don't know it. But yeah, Hong Kong, it's about extradition. Wealthy Hong Kong corporations and capitalists want to be able to go onto the Chinese mainland, break the law, and they handle it in Hong Kong, where they control the courts and where they're wealthy enough to control it. Basically, there's a lot of wealthy capitalists in Hong Kong who don't want to have the Chinese Communist Party have any jurisdiction over them. They don't want to have to follow the rules of the Chinese mainland. And they don't unless they go to the Chinese mainland. But now, basically, they want extradition. They want the ability that if they break the law on the Chinese mainland, that they could be extradited to the Chinese mainland. That's the issue. That's the issue. It's about the extradition law. And we wouldn't allow that in the United States. Hong Kong at this point is part of the People's Republic of China. We would not have a law in the United States that people from Colorado can come to New York City and break the law, and they handle it in Colorado because they're Colorado people and they get this special treatment. No. If you break the law in New York City, if you're from Colorado, you still have to go to court in New York City. That's what China wants. Why is that so outrageous? I don't understand why that's so outrageous. If it was any country but China, if it was not a socialist country, no one would be stupid enough to fall for this, right? Nobody would be stupid enough to fall for this. But mainstream media in the United States has convinced everyone this is about everything but that. Look at what the protests are about. The extradition law. That's what the protests are about. And their demand is outrageous. If I broke the law on the Chinese mainland, I would go to court on the Chinese mainland. I mean, if I went to Colorado and broke the law in Colorado, I would go to court in Colorado. Why do capitalists in Hong Kong get a special exemption? I mean, what is this about? Because they control the court system in Hong Kong, because it's corrupt. Hong Kong has a huge amount of corruption. And they know that they can rig the Hong Kong court system. And they don't want the Chinese Communist Party to be able to tell them what to do. That's what this is about. It's the wealthiest people who support it. It's a lot of young people who are just in awe of the United States. I don't understand it. It frustrates me. It's one of these things where it's like, people that would never raise a finger to protest against the crimes of their own government, never march against the Iraq War. Suddenly they see protests on the other side of the world and mainstream media is cheering for them, so it's safe to just agree with them. It's pathetic. It's really pathetic. It bothers me. Sorry, I'm getting angry here. All right. What do I think about socialists and communists who want people to vote for Biden? Well, I mean, Biden might be better than Trump. He might be. Right? I mean, he's certainly better on immigration than Trump. He's more pro-labor union than Trump. But he's more in favor of tech censorship than Trump is. He's more for a geopolitical confrontation with Russia and China than Trump is. I mean, I don't know. I mean, he might be better than Trump. Might not be. That's all there is to it. The notion that Trump is a fascist and we're all going to die if Trump gets reelected and we're all going to be put in death camps is absolutely ridiculous. Trump were a fascist, he would have hit the ground running amid this pandemic. He would have snapped into motion. It would have been Hitler's Reichstag fire. He would have used it to sweepingly repress people and all of that. Yeah, Trump's not a fascist. Trump is not a fascist. Trump is actually closer to an economic libertarian. He fools around with some of the national populist, paleo-conservative stuff, but Trump's not a fascist. We're not all going to die if Trump gets reelected. If Trump gets reelected, we'll get more of the same, what we're dealing with right now. The contradictions of the country will continue to increase. The same with Biden. There are divisions within the ruling class right now. There are different interest groups. Biden represents more the ultra-rich, the Rockefellers, Silicon Valley, importance of the black church in the freedom struggle, potential role in socialist movements for today. Okay, writing it down. Black church, freedom struggle. But yeah, he might be better than Trump, might not be. I don't endorse any candidate as a journalist, and I'm certainly no fan of Donald Trump, but there's a lot of things about Biden that are unattractive to me, but maybe he's better than Trump, maybe he's not. I don't know. Second Amendment in Socialist USA. Okay. All right, writing it down. Second Amendment in Socialist USA. Maybe he's better than Trump, maybe he's not. I don't appreciate, I guess what I don't like is we have to vote for Biden or else we're all going to die. And that's a problem. And with global warming, it's the same thing. Global warming, have to vote for the Democrats, the world's going to burst into flame. PFLP. Okay. I'm sorry, what was the question about PFLP? I want to get it right. What was the question about PFLP? What was the question? I saw PFLP, and what was the question about it? What was the question? Waiting for someone to repeat the PFLP super chat because I don't want to get it wrong. Someone asked me something about, do you think PFLP were ultra left? Okay. All right. Okay. So, I don't appreciate the catastrophe theory that we should all vote for Biden or else we're all going to die. We're not going to all die if Trump gets reelected. We didn't die when he got elected. We're not all going to die if Trump gets reelected. We're not all going to die if Biden gets reelected either. There are divisions within the ruling class. There is an intensifying class struggle at this point, but if Trump was capable of setting up a fascist state, he would have done it by now. And there are many things that are particularly ugly and vile about the Joe Biden faction of the ruling class also. But that said, I can understand why some people are going to vote for him because they think he's better, but I can understand why a lot of people are not going to vote for him. I would never vote for Biden, but I would never vote for Trump either. There's divisions within the ruling class. There are factional disagreements. This isn't fascism versus democracy. This is lower level capitalists versus higher level capitalists. This is Trump's faction of Bernie Marcus and Betsy DeVos and Sheldon Adelson and the fracking companies versus Silicon Valley and Wall Street. Biden is Silicon Valley and Wall Street, and Trump is lower level capitalist, Hobby Lobby, and the Likud party in Israel, and the Gusano, anti-Cuba fanatics in Miami, and the Shah supporters in Iran, not in Iran, but in Southern California. And it's a coalition of lower level capitalists who feel like they're locked out of the club and feel like the Obama administration didn't give them respect. That's really certain leftists adamant to abolish billionaires. Okay, yeah, we'll talk about that for sure. Alrighty. And, there's a factional fight. It's the military-industrial complex, that's Trump, versus the CIA, which is Biden, which is Biden, right? That's the division. That's what's going on there. And, these factions are going to battle each other out, and it's getting more intense, but no, it's not democracy or fascism. And the thing is, communists really don't have any, it's not like during the 30s where communists were a big factor in the Roosevelt coalition. We're not a big factor right now. DSA has emerged, and DSA is gaining some momentum, and that's a good thing. Despite whatever DSA's flaws are, it's a very good thing. So it's complicated. All right, enough about that. Mao cult of the 1960s. Yeah, well, the Soviet Union, with Khrushchev, the Soviet Union was presenting itself as was basically trying to cozy up to Western imperialism. during the 1960s, Khrushchev, he had the three peacefuls: peaceful transition, peaceful coexistence, peaceful competition. And he was basically trying to send a message to Western capitalism: look, we're not a threat anymore. We're not revolutionary. He gave that secret speech in 1956, and it was the Soviet Union was trying to downplay the idea that it was revolutionary, and it was telling socialists and communists in the developing world not to take up arms against the brutal military dictatorships the United States is backing. Right? All over the world is telling communists, don't take up arms, don't rock the boat. The United States has the atomic bomb, and there could be a nuclear war, so just call off the revolution. And it was détente, they called it, where the Soviet Union was not putting forward third world revolution. They didn't believe in third world revolution. They believed in détente. With Kennedy, Johnson, Khrushchev, that was the policy. So China, on the other hand, tried to present itself as the opposite. They were the bastion of revolution. China was the center of world revolution, right? They were the most radical. They were the most revolutionary. They had the Cultural Revolution in China, which was an attempt to just wipe out anything in China that was not communist, right? They tore down ancient temples. They changed the names of streets. They did a lot of things, right? And it was just kind of this mobilization. And there was the big purge of the Communist Party. When they had their Communist Party convention in 1969, it was a whole new party. There was Red Guard young people. A lot of the old Communist Party members had been pushed out. People were sent to the countryside. And so around the world, because China had mobilized young people and had this big political upsurge, they had the Little Red Book and all of that, there was a huge surge of international enthusiasm for the Cultural Revolution and for Mao. Yeah, I mean, that's all there was to it. I mean, and it started out in the early 60s. There was an attempt to look into socialism and communism still popular in Russia. All right. There was an effort to support Mao, and Mao was an inspiration. There was a novelist in the United States who wrote "Love is a Many Splendored Thing." I can't remember her name, but she's a novelist. And she was just a popular romance novelist who was Chinese, and she fell in love with the Cultural Revolution. There was a lot of people that were in awe of Mao and the land reform and the Cultural Revolution. And it was especially big in France in the May of '68 uprising, huge Maoist factions and Maoist groups. And Mao and the Cultural Revolution, it was a big explosion of popular anger, and young people were being empowered. Radicals in the United States, they used to chant Mao, Mao, Mao Zedong, revolution by the young, Mao, Mao, Mao Zedong, revolution by the young, and wave the Little Red Book around. And it was a thing. And it was all throughout U.S. society. There's the movie Car Wash, if you ever see it. It's a 1970s movie about a group of African-American young people who work at a car wash. But then the guy who owns the car wash is a white guy, and his teenage son shows up with a Little Red Book and is trying to lecture the workers at the car wash about communism. You ever watch the movie Network? It shows Maoist influence on society. And it was kind of a global fascination, because Mao was this leader of 1/4 of humanity at that point. Now it's like 1/5 of humanity, but it was 1/4 of humanity at that point. And he was leading this mass political upsurge called the Cultural Revolution. And people were studying his writings, and it was deeply influential. The Black Panthers studied the Little Red Book. Students for a Democratic Society, it started out as kind of a liberal social democratic group, but by the end, by 1969, when it collapsed, every faction claimed they were Maoists. The Progressive Labor Party, they claimed they were Maoists. The Weathermen claimed that they were Maoists. The Revolutionary Youth Movement too, they claimed they were Maoists. And the final SDS convention in Chicago, where the group collapsed because of the Weathermen, every faction, they were all waving the Red Book, claiming they were Maoists and beating each other up and stuff. And it was pretty wild. So yeah, it was a big political upsurge that happened. I actually gave a very good class on it called Mao and American Socialists, and you can watch it, where I talk about the history of Mao and his influence on American revolutionaries. And it was quite a successful class that I did in New York City. So there you go. All right. Liu Shaoqi. Liu Shaoqi was a figure in the Chinese Communist Party who was seen as a rival of Mao, and he was the target of the Cultural Revolution. He actually wrote a book called How to Be a Good Communist, and he was seen as a rival of Mao. And the Cultural Revolution, they forced him to go to the countryside, I believe, and he was driven out of the government. He was labeled as a capitalist roader. He was seen as pro-Soviet, right? The Soviet Union had cut off China, had been the Sino-Soviet split. And I think it was alleged that Liu Shaoqi harbored pro-Soviet sentiments. The Cultural Revolution was aimed at him. He was kind of the example of a capitalist roader. And from what I understand, after the Cultural Revolution was over, if I'm not mistaken, he's been revived. The Chinese Communist Party has now said that it was wrong the way he was targeted in the Cultural Revolution. He wrote... He was a figure, and it's funny because his book, How to Be a Good Communist, many people have called that the Little Yellow Book, which I think is hilarious. China committing $2 billion to the fight against COVID-19, writing it down. It was referred to as the revisionist book. So there you go. There you go. So yeah, that was the Cultural Revolution, and yeah, okay. Okay, socialists in Iraq. Well, there was the Iraqi Communist Party. Okay, so the Iraqi Communist Party, it was formed in the it goes way back, but in the 1950s, it was part of supporting, there was a Popular Front government in Iraq led by General Qasem. And that government was overthrown, and the Iraqi Communist Party was mostly, it was opposed to Baathist Arab socialism, but there was a split. There was the Communist Party of Iraq that was supporting Baathist Arab socialism. So there was a divide. The Iraqi Communist Party was seen as the anti-Baath faction, and the Communist Party of Iraq was seen as the pro-Baath faction. There were a number of people in the Iraqi Communist Party who were executed by the Baath. But then there were a number of people from the Communist Party of Iraq that were actually in the government. And it was one of the few opposition parties during, it was in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, you had the Baathist Arab Socialist Party was the ruling party. But one of the parties, the Communist Party of Iraq, not to be confused with the Iraqi Communist Party, but the Communist Party of Iraq was actually legal and had a few seats and functioned. And that happened, right? And that the relationship between Iraq and the Soviet Union was not always good. Sometimes it was good, other times it was not. I think that the Communist Party of Iraq was seen as the pro-Soviet wing of the Baath Party. Qasem, the general who'd been overthrown, was far more sympathetic, to the Iraqi Communist Party. The Baath basically accused the Iraqi Communist Party of not being revolutionary enough. They argued that the Baath Party was more revolutionary. It's actually kind of fascinating. And many people will try to claim that Saddam Hussein was just a CIA agent the whole time, and that he killed the communists on behalf of U.S. That's not exactly correct, right? It's much more complicated than that. I guess that's what I'll say about that. And today in Iraq, I know that the Communist Party of Iraq is is in the government. I mean, it has a position. It's in coalition. I believe they were in a coalition with Muqtada al-Sadr, who is the Shia cleric, the anti-Iranian Shia cleric, right? There are pro-Iranian Shia clerics in Iraq. Muqtada al-Sadr is a Shia cleric, but he is anti-Iranian, or was anti-Iranian. And he entered a coalition with the Iraqi Communist Party. And the Iraqi Communist Party now, because they have representation in the government. They have representation. I believe that they advocate, separation for Kurdistan. They advocate independence for Kurdistan. And, they exist. And there are some other, Marxist groups in Iraq. I think there was, I'm trying to remember, but there was like Iraqi Communist Party cadre or al-Qadre or something like that. There was Iraqi Marxist-Leninist regroupment at one point. And that there are different leftist groups in Iraq. But, there's a big Shia Muslim movement in Iraq. And the Shia Muslim, community in Iraq, a lot of them will, put up pictures of Che Guevara and Hugo Chavez, and they identify as anti-imperialists. And then there's the Baath Party that still exists in Iraq, but the Baath Party is the main source of, Baathist elements tend to be aligned with Saudi Arabia against Iran. And they see Iranian influence as the main threat to Iraq. So it's very complicated. The Iraqi political situation is very, very complicated. All right, Iran and Syria. All right. Right, so, you know, the Baath tends to be anti-Iranian, right, whereas you have the Shia community, and then you have Iraqi Communist Party, and you have some in the Shia community that are very pro-Iranian, others that are, you know, somewhat cold to Iran. Muqtada al-Sadr apparently created an alliance with the Iraqi communists. There was even a communist militia in Iraq that fought ISIS. And there were pictures, you know, of this communist militia group. You know, they formed an armed group in some of the communist neighborhoods to fight ISIS in Iraq. Bet you didn't know that. I think that's pretty fascinating. Enough on that. Okay, Yugoslavia, 1999. So in 1999, Bill Clinton bombed Yugoslavia. I was a kid. I was a fifth grader. And we were all told that Kosovoans were being brutally oppressed by the Serbian government. And so, you know, it was humanitarian intervention. We had to, you know, intervene to rescue these people that were being killed by the brutal dictator Milosevic. Right? Now, what we were not told, what I did not know as a kid, because they didn't say this on the news, and was that Kosovo has always been part of Serbia. It's not an independent region. And that the people in Kosovo who wanted independence were not Kosovoans, they were ethnic Albanians, right? After the fall of socialism in Albania, Yugoslavia was still socialist, right? And Serbia was one of the most strongly socialist parts of Yugoslavia. So Albanians started moving into Kosovo to get jobs, working in the mines, and to try and survive. And Albanians tended to be Muslim. And Saudi Arabia was giving lots of money, and the CIA and Western capitalism was funding radical Islamic Wahhabi, you know, fanatics among the Kosovo Albanians, right? The Albanians coming into Kosovo were being radicalized by Saudi Arabia and the United States. And the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, this Western CIA-backed terrorist group of jihadists and fanatical Wahhabi Muslim extremists, they were set up and they were engaging in terrorism. And there was a civil war going on. The Serbian government was fighting against the Kosovo Liberation Army. That was never told to us. We were told, just like we're told about Syria, very similar to Syria. The way it was presented on TV to me and to most Americans was there's this evil dictator named Milosevic, and he just started killing people because they're Kosovoan, they're Kosovo Albanians, and it's awful, and he's a dictator and he's murdering people. And that was not what was happening. You know, what was happening was there was a civil war fomented by the United States and by Saudi Arabia and by Western capitalism against a socialist government, right? Slobodan Milosevic was the leader of the Socialist Party in Serbia. And I'm sure war crimes were committed. I'm sure that there were atrocities and brutal crimes, but the reality of the situation was that a socialist government was waging a civil war against, you know, terrorists and Islamic jihadists backed by the United States. That's what was going on. And they were trying to break Kosovo away from Serbia. And, you know, that's the situation that was happening. And Bill Clinton, of course, it was what we always heard, right? Humanitarian intervention, right? There's a group of people, they're being killed. And now the UN has come forward and said that genocide did not take place in Yugoslavia. The UN has confirmed that. There was no genocide in Yugoslavia. There was a photo that was used. A photo. A very famous photo of a man standing behind a barbed wire fence. And he's very skinny. And it reminded everyone of the Holocaust. Of course it does, right? You know, really skinny person standing behind a barbed wire fence, you think of the Holocaust. Well, it was revealed that that photo, the way it was taken, the man was not behind, the fence was just there. He was walking by the fence. Cultural Revolution. All right. He was just walking by the fence, number one. And the man was skinny because he had a disease. He wasn't skinny because he was being starved like a concentration camp prisoner. I mean, you should read. There's a very good book, War, Lies, and Videotape, where Michael Parenti has essays. Other people have essays in there exposing how the war in Yugoslavia was. I mean, there's a lot exposing this. The war, the bombing of Yugoslavia, of Belgrade, it was based on lies, war propaganda lies. And one of the main salespeople of the war. The main warmonger was Samantha Power. Samantha Power admits that she's basically a war salesperson, right? She's a warmonger. A fishmonger sells fish. Well, Samantha Power is a warmonger, right? She was UN ambassador under Obama. She's a warmonger. She sells war. And her journalism in Yugoslavia was really just trying to create propaganda for U.S. military interventions. Michael Parenti, great book, To Kill a Nation. He goes into great detail. All over former Yugoslavia, the United States was funding all kinds of brutal terrorist groups. All kinds of fascist admiring, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi groups that were dividing, the people of Yugoslavia, playing ethnicities against each other, Croatians against Macedonians, Serbs against, it was awful. And the Serbs were viciously targeted because Serbia was a stronghold of socialism. Slobodan Milosevic was from the Socialist Party, and he, was demonized. They called him a Stalinist. They called him a communist. And he was not going to privatize the economy. He wasn't going to break apart Yugoslavia. And the bombing of Yugoslavia resulted in the destruction of some of the oldest, most beautiful churches in the world. Thousands of people were killed. It was atrocious. It was not in any way conceivably justified. But just like Syria, just like Libya, it was sold to the world. It was sold to the world as humanitarian intervention. Right? It was, these people are being killed, and the Pentagon just wants to go rescue them. Oh, don't be an isolationist. Don't be an isolationist. We have to intervene. We have a moral obligation to intervene. That's how the war was sold. And if you disagreed with that, right, they equated you with a Holocaust denier. The movie Schindler's List had come out in the 90s. And that was the new way wars were being sold, right? And suddenly, and that's the crazy thing, the United States was in bed with Hitler, right? Henry Ford did business with Hitler. The USA wouldn't sign an alliance with the Soviet Union against Hitler. But somehow they've rewritten the history of the Second World War, where World War II happened because the USA didn't invade Germany, right? And World War II suddenly became a case for military interventionism around the world. Every person that the USA is fighting, Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, Assad, Gaddafi, they're all Hitlers, right? And we made a mistake. We didn't invade Germany as soon as Hitler got elected, and he carried out the Holocaust. The Holocaust proves that we need humanitarian intervention. That was the narrative that was used to justify wars. And I mean, if you look at it, I mean, there's a reason that Hitler was in power, because the capitalists liked him. They saw him as fighting against socialism, right? That World War II is not a case for humanitarian interventionism. That's Hitler was interventionism. Hitler was backed into power to fight communists, right? I mean, it's like people don't understand this, but the way in the 90s, the way the narrative of World War II kind of evolved was that, that the Holocaust was the result of the USA not invading countries. So we have to invade countries or else Holocausts will happen. That's what I learned in school. That's what I was taught in school. The USA has to invade countries to stop Holocausts. And everyone we fight against, every anti-imperialist government, no matter who it is, it's another Hitler. And World War II happened because we didn't invade. That's the narrative, right? And that's the narrative you got in American media in the 90s. It's that humanitarian intervention narrative. And it's deadly, because in Yugoslavia, the United States was actively fomenting a civil war against the Serbian government. It wasn't humanitarian intervention. And the result has been far, far worse. The conditions since the overthrow of socialism in Serbia, things have gotten a lot worse. In Kosovo, the conditions there, since it's become like a UN colony, it's broken away, it's gotten worse. And the facts have come out. Slobodan Milosevic died before his trial could be completed in The Hague. But the facts have come out. There was no genocide. The UN confirms there was not. Yes, there were atrocities. There were certainly atrocities committed in the Civil War. No one denies that. No one denies that Serbian troops committed atrocities against the Kosovo Liberation Army and against civilians. Okay, these atrocities happened. But was there genocide? Was there a plot to exterminate, Albanians? No, there was not. Okay, and the UN confirms that. So the United States destroyed a country, bombed all kinds of people based on a lie, right? And this is the same old story. It's just like, the Naria testimony before the USA invaded Iraq. They had this girl, get up and she cried on CNN. They're taking babies and throwing them out of the incubators. And she cried on CNN, and she just cried, and she convinced the American people we had to send troops to Kuwait to stop Saddam Hussein because they're taking babies from incubators and they're throwing them. And it was fake. It was a lie. It was staged. Read about the Naria testimony. It was staged. It was a lie. And they do this. Here's the thing that annoys me about this, folks. I'm sorry I'm getting all whatever. I'm a little tired, but human beings, like I said in my introduction, are good. When we see someone else suffering, we want to help them. We care about them. When we hear about somebody on the other side of the world being killed and oppressed, we want to help them. We're not libertarians. We're not Ayn Rand, okay? We're not heartless, ruthless. We care about other people. We do. Deep down, we care about other people. And the imperialists, with their propaganda media, have figured out how to manipulate our good side. They're using our good side for evil. They are manipulating our better side. They have figured out how to manipulate basic feelings of human solidarity in order to feed their agenda of war and profits and empire. That's the reality. I mean, Invisible Children, right? Mini children's book on the Bosnian Civil War. That my brother, okay. Yeah, I mean, I believe it, right? There's a mini children's book to sell it. I mean, I was sold it in school, right? Mini children's book. Yeah, I was sold that, in school they told us all, and it was the party line, just like the line on Syria now. And that these basic feelings of human solidarity that are good are manipulated to feed the war agenda, and they make life worse. Look at Libya now. We were told, oh, Gaddafi's killing people. Look what happened in Libya. Life is far worse. A decade later, life is worse. Look at Syria. Has Syria in any way gotten better because the USA provided arms and weapons to terrorist groups and seized the oil? No. Has Afghanistan gotten any better since the overthrow of the Taliban? Has Iraq gotten any better since the overthrow of Saddam Hussein? Has Honduras gotten any better since the USA toppled Manuel Zelaya in 2009? It never makes life any better. But these stupid people, a lot of whom call themselves socialists and communists, fall for it every time. I mean, it's like Albert Einstein, right? Or it's not Albert Einstein, he didn't say it, but the whole thing about how, insanity is you make the same mistake over and over and over again. I swear, there are certain socialists, every time there's a new war, they believe the humanitarian narrative. And then they're like, oh, I don't want to be a tanky. And they don't. It's like, it's so obvious that the war, is, they're telling us all the lies. The lies are coming out of the TV screen at us. So-and-so's a Hitler. The USA has to invade to rescue the poor people. And there's a big percentage of socialists who go along with it out of this stupid desire to not be a tanky or something like that. And then what happens? What happened in Yugoslavia? What happened in Iraq? What happened in Afghanistan? What happened in Syria? What happened in Libya? What happened, right? You were a socialist, but you went along with it because, I don't want to be a tanky. I want people in my college class to like me. I don't want to be a tanky. And then what happened? What happened? Did it get better for the people? No. Nope. Wrong. Don't go along with humanitarian interventionism. Don't go along with the war propaganda. When CNN starts calling some leader a Hitler and a dictator and tells you it's time to invade because we got to, don't go along with it. Don't go along with it. Don't fall for it. Don't get fooled again, like the old Who song. And the same with Yugoslavia. It's the same story. Don't get fooled again. Don't get fooled again. I'm urging you to not get fooled again. And it drives me crazy. It drives me absolutely crazy. It is my biggest pet peeve to see people fall for this over and over again. And people who should know better. If you're a socialist, you should know better. If you're a communist, you should know better. Right? Ordinary people, there's a lot of political education. But if you understand Marxism and socialism, don't get fooled again. Don't get fooled again. All right. I think that was Yugoslavia. Leftists in Iran. Right. Well, we all know, I was asked specifically, MEK is this group that was leftist at the time of the Iranian Revolution. Now they're neocons. They're working with Israel and the United States. They've killed Iranian scientists. They're a crazy, fanatical cult, the Mujahideen cult, crazy nut jobs. They were leftists at one point. They were always kind of an Armageddon doomsday cult. It was like the Iranian equivalent of the People's Temple and Jim Jones. They thought their leader was the reincarnation of of Jesus and Lenin combined or something. It was the same kind of thing, right? It was this crazy death cult in Iran, the Mujahideen cult. They supported the Iranian Revolution at first. When one of their religious leaders got disbarred, they went on a killing spree. They bombed the Iranian parliament and killed a number of parliamentarians. The reason that the supreme leader of Iran can't move one of his arms is because they bombed one of his press conferences. Just a vicious group of people. And that's the Mujahideen cult. At the time of the Iranian Revolution, there were three factions among the Iranian communists. The first was the Tudeh Party, which was the Communist Party of Iran. The second was the Fedayeen, the People's Fedayeen guerrillas. They were like Che Guevara, kind of new left, whatever. And then you had the Mujahideen cult, which were Islamo-Marxists, which were fanatical, apocalyptic cultists, right? Those were the three main groups. The Tudeh Party, at the time, the Iraq-Iran war happened, right? Iran was invaded by Iraq. At that point, the Communist Party of Iraq was outlawed. The Tudeh Party was outlawed because the Soviet Union was seen as supporting Saddam Hussein, right? Saddam Hussein had gotten all of his military equipment and weapons from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was selling a lot of weapons to Saddam Hussein. So because of that, the Marxists were seen as an anti-Islamic party. They were not supporting the Islamic Republic because the Islamic Republic believes in Islam. Marxists are seen as atheists. So the Tudeh Party and the Fedayeen were outlawed. And so they were outlawed. Now, at that point, there were a number of leftists who dissolved or who formed Islamic organizations. There was the Students Taking Imam's Line. I believe that was a group that was key in the hostage taking. They were communists in Iran, and a lot of them were Marxists, but they adopted Islam and became an Islamic organization. I think there's something in Iran like the Labor Party or something, the Islamic Labor Party or something, but it's a socialist group that has accepted Islam and is part of the government. And then there's a lot of Iranian communists who've gone into exile. And there are many different groups. The Tudeh Party, there's not an official Tudeh Party. There's many different groups. And there's also, Fedayeen. There's many different Fedayeen groups in exile. They don't all agree with each other. But the other thing is that, that there are many leftists in Iran, and, who accept Islam, accept the Islamic Republic, and participate in the government. In particular, Iran's relations with Latin America are organized by leftists, right? People that accept Islam but also have a leftist perspective. There are television programs in Iran by academics that have a Marxist critique of U.S. imperialism. I went to bookstores in Iran. I found the writings of Karl Marx on the shelf. I found the writings of Lenin and Che Guevara on the shelf in bookstores near Iranian universities. You can't form a Marxist organization in Iran because that would be considered to be an organization that would be hostile to the goals of the Islamic Republic. But socialist ideas are all over Iran, I'll tell you that much. And the Bolivarian countries, Hugo Chavez is widely admired in Iran. Venezuela is widely admired. Che Guevara is widely admired. Malcolm X is particularly loved and admired. The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn is actually taught in Iranian schools. Bet you didn't know that. But in many Iranian schools, they read the Farsi interpretation, the Farsi translation of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Fascinating. So it's not as simple as you think. Iran is very, very religious, very, very socially conservative. But at the same time, in Iranian economics, the way the economic system works is very influenced by Marxism. They call their system not capitalism, but Islam. It's complicated. Like most things in the world, they're complicated. Things are not simple. I know I'm talking fast, but I'm getting tired here, so there you go. Alrighty. The Black Church and the Freedom Struggle. Well, it's particularly interesting. This is the next super chat. It's particularly interesting. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, they taught, at one point they had an alliance with the Socialist Party and with Eugene Debs in their history, the AME Church, and that there were a number of black churches that associated with the socialists and with the left in the 1920s and teens, right? At the time that the NAACP was formed, the Communist Party had not yet come into existence, but W.E.B. Du Bois, who was, this well-known African-American scholar. He wrote The Souls of Black Folk. W.E.B. Du Bois was a member of the Socialist Party, and the NAACP was formed, and the NAACP was considered to be a wing, was to be considered to be part of the Socialist Party. It was a socialist or leftist group. What's interesting, though, is unfortunately there was also a lot of racist socialists, at that time as well. There were a number of Socialist Party groups that were pro-segregation and such. And it was the Communist Party. What distinguished the Communist Party was that they, from the beginning, were anti-racist and viewed black people as a nation, as a colonized people within U.S. borders who were oppressed. And that the black church, yes, has played an important role in the black freedom struggle in the United States. No one can deny that. In fact, little known fact, in 1954, you had the Montgomery bus boycott. And the reason that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became the leader of it was because he was very young. And all the older pastors in the black community in Montgomery, Alabama, who were willing to be involved in civil rights had ties to the Communist Party, right? Martin Luther King was young enough that he didn't have ties to the Communist Party. But there were a number of older pastors who were part of the Montgomery bus boycott, but they wouldn't let them be the spokespeople because at the time it was the time of McCarthyism. And anybody in Montgomery, Alabama, who had worked for civil rights during the 1930s had ties to communism, right? Because the communists were the anti-racists. There's a great book called Hammer and Hoe by Robin D.G. Kelly that talks about how big the Communist Party was in Alabama during the 1930s. And in the black community in particular, the Communist Party became such a deeply influential organization in the black community, and that many black pastors who fought for civil rights, joined the Communist Party or were associated with it or were friendly to it. And Martin Luther King Jr. was young enough that the FBI and the media couldn't call him a communist. They did anyway, but it was something they tried to divert, which I think is fascinating. But yeah, I mean, the black church and the Communist Party had a very good relationship. And actually, there was a black minister in New York City during the 1930s called Father Divine. I don't know if people have ever heard of Father Divine, but he was an African-American minister in the 1930s in Harlem. He was called Father Divine. And he had an interracial congregation. They set up shop in Harlem. They owned a lot of restaurants. And Father Divine was an ally of the Communist Party USA. And he marched with them against the bombing of Ethiopia and the invasion of Ethiopia by fascist Italy. And he marched with them against anti-Semitism, and he marched with them for hands off the Soviet Union. And Father Divine, who was this very, very prominent black pastor that many people called a cultist. Many people said that he was a cult. But the Communist Party USA and Father Divine had an alliance, and that's particularly fascinating. And that Father Divine, was a very important figure in Harlem during the 1930s. And it was a cult. It was kind of a utopian cult, a religious Christian group led by African Americans, but black and white together. But the Communist Party had a strategic alliance because they were opposed to racism, they were opposed to fascism and discrimination. And I think that's fascinating. If you look at the Communist Party USA and their alliance with, Reverend Father Divine or whatever, it's fascinating. Now, what's interesting is the Nation of Islam, which is a religious group among African Americans, did not like the Communist Party, mainly because the Communist Party supported the Second World War, and the Nation of Islam did not support the Second World War. The Nation of Islam argued that African Americans had nothing to gain in World War II. That they wouldn't, and so the Nation of Islam encouraged draft resistance during the Second World War. The Communist Party encouraged participation in the Second World War. All right. Okay. Why did Bernie Sanders become a social democrat? Writing it down. All right, so the Communist Party, encouraged, everything for victory to defeat the Nazis. The Nation of Islam called for draft resistance. But what's weird, and this is, again, the Trotskyites really liked the Nation of Islam because they were opposed to World War II, whereas the Communist Party, didn't. So, that was weird. Now, after the Second World War, black nationalism continued to be popular in the United States, and the Communist Party maintained its support for black nationalism. And officially, on paper, the Communist Party would have supported the Nation of Islam because they supported black nationalism, but they didn't have a good relationship. But then Malcolm X, as he got to be prominent, the Trotskyites, it was actually Malcolm X spoke at SWP, Socialist Workers' Party events. And Malcolm X ended up becoming, his books still to this day, the book rights of Malcolm X's speeches and articles and his actual writings, not autobiography of Malcolm X, which was actually written by Alex Haley, but the actual writings of Malcolm X are owned by Pathfinder Press, which is the Trotskyite SWP. It's their publishing house. So, the Nation of Islam, the original Nation of Islam, had a relationship with Trotskyists that went way back, which is fascinating. It may have been the fact that the Trotskyists and Elijah Muhammad went to federal prison at the same time. I mean, maybe they were able to meet each other in federal prison or something, but there was a relationship between the Trotskyists and the Nation of Islam, so much so that Malcolm X would speak at Trotskyite meetings and Trotskyite events. I think that's fascinating. And then we all know that in 1957, the Communist Party dropped its position that black people are a nation. Before that, the Communist Party, it had opposed racism and supported civil rights, but maintained black people were a nation and primarily supported black nationalism. But then in 1957, the Communist Party announced it no longer supported black nationalism. So it's a complicated thing. Thank you for the super chat, EE Camp. I appreciate it. Okay. All right. Just plowing on ahead. Okay. The Second Amendment in a socialist USA. Well, here's the thing, right? Would there be a Second Amendment in the socialist United States? I don't know. It would depend. I mean, obviously, I think that I would assume that, that after an anti-monopoly government took power, this is all hypothetical. We don't know what's going to happen. But in theory, after an anti-monopoly government took power, in theory, perhaps they would want to pass a new constitution. And would that constitution include the right to bear arms or not? The way that they portray socialist countries, I've seen these bumper stickers my whole life, like there's a bumper sticker I saw, it says famous gun control advocates. It has Hitler and Stalin and Fidel Castro and Mao or something. It's like this is a big thing. But, people were heavily armed in Cuba. People were heavily armed in the Soviet Union. Hunting was a national pastime. And gun control was imposed in Germany before Hitler. It was imposed by the Weimar Republic. Part of the reason the Nazis came to power is they had outlawed the communist militias that fought Hitler. So, that didn't work. But what was interesting was that, so would there be a Second Amendment? Well, I mean, in a lot of socialist countries, they've made a big point of trying to arm the population. They have the feeling that there should be people's militias. In Venezuela, they have the Bolivarian assemblies, or the Bolivarian militias, they're called. It's like armed groups that are separate from the actual military, that are loyal to the revolution. And it's some kind of popular armed group, probably would exist in a socialist society. But the question, I guess, of the Second Amendment is, is it an inalienable right of an individual to own a gun? Not should gun ownership be allowed, but is it an inalienable right? And that's the thing. What people don't understand is that the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution makes it very hard to impose gun control because it says that owning a gun is a constitutional right, right? In the United States, they can't take your free speech away unless you violate the law. If you go to prison, you don't have any free speech. Is Myanmar a communist country? No, it's not. But I'll address that later. Right? The government can't say, you know what, you don't get your free speech unless you break the law. The government can't say you can't choose your own religion unless you break the law. And even then, prisoners are able to maintain some level of religious freedom, right? So the right to own a gun by the Supreme Court interprets the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution as saying that the right to own a gun is a fundamental constitutional right, meaning that you can't have your right to own a gun taken away unless you commit a crime. Right? Unless you commit a crime, they can't take your right to own a gun away. And that makes it very, very hard to impose gun control legislation because it says that owning a gun is on the level of free speech or freedom of religion or freedom of assembly. So in a socialist society, would we want the right to own a gun to be on the same level as the right to freedom of speech, right to freedom of assembly and all of that, and that, you have to really break the law, you have to be convicted in a court to have that right taken away? Would we? I mean, that's not the same as saying you want the people to have access to firearms. You're saying you want them to have, constitutionally mandated access to firearms. That's the difference. That's the difference. Okay. Okay. Was the PFLP ultra left? So the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, that was, that was a Palestinian armed resistance group that was Marxist-Leninist. And at that point, in the 60s and 70s, most of the Palestinian groups were Marxist-Leninist. Hamas and groups like that hadn't really emerged yet. That was later that they became into prominence. But yeah, the PFLP, you had Layla Khalid. She was a Palestinian woman who was a leader of the PFLP and, took hostages and did things like that. Yeah, and there was also the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There was the People's Party, which was like the Palestinian Communist Party. It was like the old Soviet Communist Party. And, I mean, it's not for me to tell the Palestinians what to do. I'm not gonna comment. I'm not really gonna answer the question. Because I mean, the Palestinians, I would hate to be in the situation that they're in. I mean, that they have been fighting for their lives. They've been brutally treated, and the resistance that they take. It's not for me to comment on what kind of resistance they engage in. One thing I do know, I'll tell you this story before I move on. When I was in college, there were some Palestinian students who were in my modern Middle East class that I took. And when we learned about Layla Khalid in my class, these Palestinian students burst into song. I started singing about Layla Khalid, a song in Arabic that's a popular Palestinian song about Layla Khalid. And they both, when the name was said, they both just burst into song. And that made me think a lot because, my grandmother, being an Irish woman, would sing IRA kind of songs around the house a little bit, some of the Irish freedom songs. And that made me think about kind of the popular resistance, Kashmir, writing it down. The spirit of resistance, and that made me think about that. But yeah, I don't take a position on Palestinian politics and what group is better than what group. I just don't go there. Okay. Abolish billionaires. Yeah, it's a problematic phrase. Because the problem isn't wealth itself. The problem is how wealth is created. The way wealth is created under capitalism is by exploiting other people. That's just the reality of how wealth is created under capitalism, by exploiting other people, right? Is that the billionaires of American capitalism got their wealth through making other people poor, by building a prison industrial complex, building a military industrial complex, getting people hooked on opioids, driving people out of their homes, ripping people off in predatory loans. The problem with billionaires, is how their wealth is acquired, not the fact that their wealth exists, and that the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world is only possible if you get to communism. And communism is only possible with a vast expansion of material abundance. In order for communism, a society with no coercion, with no government, where everyone can just do what they want to do and take what they need, from each according to his own ability, from each according to his needs, that's only possible if all of humanity lives far better than millionaires and billionaires live today. So by saying abolish billionaires, you're making it sound like wealth itself is the problem. And that's not Marxism. If you start saying people should be poorer, you're not a Marxist. If you start saying that, that the problem is that there's too much stuff in the world, you're not a Marxist. If you think the problem is technology and we need to get back to Mother Earth, you ain't a Marxist. You're not a Marxist when you start talking that way. Poverty is beautiful, Mother Teresa, not Marxism, right? You're reactionary at that point. If you think human progress and wealth are bad, not how they're carried out, which I agree, greed, capitalism, production for profit, exploiting people, that's bad. But if you think wealth itself is bad, right? If you think human progress itself is bad, you are not left-wing. You are a reactionary at that point. If you want to go backward, you are not a Marxist. You are not a leftist, right? Wealth itself is not bad. The problem is how wealth is created. That's the answer to that. Okay. And the problem with capitalism is it deprives workers of wealth and the stability of wealth. All right. Socialism and communism. Is it popular in Russia? Yeah, I mean, polls show that Russians say the Soviet Union was the best time in their history. Soviet nostalgia in Russia is at an all-time high. You know, Lenin is still in the mausoleum. There are people in Russia who want to remove Lenin, but then there's people in Russia who vehemently would oppose removing Lenin from the mausoleum. There are many, many Russians who look back on the Soviet Union and have a very positive feeling about it. The Communist Party, they're not the biggest party at this point, but they're a significant party. They represent a significant portion of the population. You know, they're not the biggest party though. You know, and you know, and a lot of the ways that the current Russian government operates, you know, is rooted in the Soviet history period. I mean, the national anthem of Russia is still the same tune as the Soviet national anthem. You know, and there are many Russians who admire the history of the Soviet Union. But there's a difference between admiring the history of the Soviet Union and wanting to bring it back. And I think that's the difference. I know Vladimir Putin has said anyone who doesn't mourn the loss of the Soviet Union has no heart, but anyone who wants to bring it back has no brain. That's Vladimir Putin. And he said that a number of times. And that, you know, I mean, Stalin, many Russians admire Stalin and think Stalin was a great leader who defeated the Nazis, who industrialized the country. You know, but there are many Russians who admire Stalin who aren't communists. So it's complicated, you know, and I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church is very anti-capitalist and it opposes the lending of money for profits. It calls for a welfare state. The Russian Orthodox Church is very, very communist in its approach, but it rejects Marxism. So it's complicated. These things are never as simple as you think, right? I'm repeating myself, but it's kind of like what I said about Iran. Things are complicated. The Russian Orthodox Church is very anti-capitalist. You know, there's a lot of Soviet nostalgia. And there's a Communist Party in Russia that has a lot of seats in the parliament. But does that translate to, you know, people in Russia all want to be communist? They want to bring the Soviet Union back? Not necessarily. No. I would say, you know, there is a lot of Soviet nostalgia. There's a huge influence of Marxism on the country. I mean, you can't say that it's like, kind of like how Christianity has influenced the United States. You know, you can be in the United States, you can be an atheist, you can be a Muslim, but it's like Christmas is a national holiday. There are religious symbols everywhere. Christianity has left its mark on U.S. society. Well, you go to the Soviet Union, sure, the 90s happened, you know, and all that. Not a communist country, not a communist party in power, but it's left its mark. It has left its mark, and, you know, I mean, there is no modern Russia without communism. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that everyone has good feelings about it, right? It's complicated, but yeah, I hope that answers the question. Alrighty, China gives $2 billion for COVID-19. Great. I mean, China is leading the fight. And here's what I don't understand. Folks, China should have been the country hardest hit by COVID-19, right? They didn't get, no one had it before them. They got it before anybody. They were the first to get the outbreak. But China seems to have handled it better than everybody else. All the other people, especially the United States, we had months and months of warning, and our politicians knew it was going to be a big problem. They sold their stocks, Dianne Feinstein. But, you know, in the United States, you know, I mean, we bumbled and we tripped and we fell, but China had no warning. They got it before anybody else. They did amazingly well, and now they're supplying protective equipment, you know, protective gear to people all over the world. They're sending masks all over the world. They're sending gloves all over the world. I mean, the fact that they blame this on China, I mean, this is beyond me. I mean, if anything, it demonstrates in China how effective their socialist system is. Same for Vietnam, same for Kerala. You know, the fact that they've turned this pandemic into an argument against China rather than an argument in China's favor blows my mind. Just want to thank you for answering these super chats. I really appreciate your outlook and thoughts. Thanks, Ali. Yeah, and I'll keep going, you know. Whatever. I got a little bit of a headache, but I'll finish these off and I'll before we go. All right, Iran and Syria. Well, the Islamic Republic of Iran is working with Turkey and Syria to try and negotiate peace. Iran wants peace. Syria is on its border. And the last thing that Iran wants is Syria to collapse into a civil war and ethnic conflicts, and they already have enough problem on their Afghan border with chaos and drug dealing groups and terrorists, and they have a problem on their Iraqi border with chaos and drug dealing, terrorist groups, and all kinds of stuff. They want Syria to be stable. And people make it out like it's Iranian imperialism. That's a big thing. The Saudis are pushing this idea of the Shia crescent. And Iran is trying to take over the world. And Bashar Assad is an Alawite, and that's a kind of Shia, so this is an Iranian. No, okay? Iran has spent so much of its resources trying to stabilize Iraq because the USA destabilized Iraq, overthrew the government, created ethnic strife there. So Iran has spent lots of its money to try and stabilize Iraq. On Afghanistan, right? Iran now deals with heroin. Iran has a huge problem with heroin addiction. Like 1 in every 100 Iranians is addicted to heroin. It's a disastrous problem. And where does that heroin come from? Afghanistan. Plus, there's terrorist groups like Jindallah that want to break away Sunni regions of Iran, Sunni separatist groups. Where do they operate out of? Afghanistan. And so Iran has problems on its Iraqi border. It has problems on its Afghan border. It wants Syria to be stable. I mean, could you imagine? It would be like the United States, Mexico, big ugly civil war and terrorist groups on one border. Canada, big ugly civil war. I mean, we would be beside ourselves. Iran wants to keep itself safe, and Iran is probably one of the safest countries in that region in terms of terrorist attacks and all of that. They are really safe. The population is stable. They have the country under control, and they have a really big rate of development. They've built huge highways and power plants, but they want to be stable. And so stabilizing Syria is important. And they are trying to negotiate with Turkey and with Syria, and they're trying to make peace in that region. That is in Iran's interest. And Iran has spent lots and lots of its money, to try and stabilize. And that's wrong. That is, the United States is basically bankrupting Iran. Iran is trying to have stability on its borders by throwing money. I mean, and they have to. They have no choice, right? And that's Iranian influence in Iraq. They have done so much to try and stabilize. All around Iran is chaos. The Islamic Republic has managed to hold that society together. And I mean, that's a strong argument in their favor. But they are surrounded by utter chaos and destruction. So people who say Iran is destabilizing the region, it's backwards. Iran is desperately trying to stabilize the region. It's the United States, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, that is destabilizing the region. Iran wants peace. I mean, more than anything, Iran wants peace. Iran is not trying to export, the revolution. It's not the 1980s. In the early 80s, yes, the Ayatollah was, that was a different situation. Now, basically, Iran is desperately trying to keep its borders secure, stop the rise of terrorist groups and instability all around it. Okay. Yeah, the Cultural Revolution, when I was like a teenager, I was very inspired by the Cultural Revolution. I read this book called Daily Life in Revolutionary China. I read some pamphlets from the RCP, and I thought the Cultural Revolution was amazing, and the young people are, overthrowing their teachers. But the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. All right, Bahrain. All right, the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. It was very, very bad. The Gang of Four the Cultural Revolution was not good. I have never met anyone from China who says the Cultural Revolution was good. It was a disaster. Now, some I would argue it was necessary. They needed to do it, or else there would have been a counter-revolution. The Communist Party had to secure its ideological control of the country. But the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. It was a bad, bad time in China's history. Anyone who lived through it will tell you that. The Chinese Communist Party opposes it and says it was the wrong move. And I think they're right. The Cultural Revolution, in a way, and some will argue, well, that's the reason the Chinese Communist Party is able to maintain hegemony, is because they wiped out, Confucianism, they wiped out Taoism, they wiped out all these ideologies, which, are still there, right? This Confucian impact in China is massive. You can't get rid of it. Buddhism is still all over China. You can't get rid of these things. But there was an attempt to wipe out any ideological, religious, or political competition with communism, right? They're going to mobilize the population they destroyed a bunch of old temples, they smashed old poetry, they burned books, they did everything to try and make sure that communism had 100% ideological hegemony in China. And a lot of people got hurt. And then in the 70s, the ideology got wacky, where they were saying that China could become communist in poverty, which is ridiculous. They were arguing that. In the 70s, the Gang of Four said you could transition to a higher stage in poverty. That China, even though most of China at that point didn't have running water and electricity, they could achieve full communism at that point. That's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. But that's what the Gang of Four was saying. They were going nuts. That's why the Gang of Four supported Pol Pot. He said similar arguments, right? That especially in the late 70s, when they deported all the young people to the countryside, the politics of the Cultural Revolution were nuts. They were nuts. They were just going nuts. And it was Deng Xiaoping ended it, and he saved China from disaster. So, yeah, I'm not for the Cultural Revolution. Again, watch my class, Mao and American Socialists. I go over all of this. Alrighty. All right. Why did Bernie Sanders become a social democrat? Well, in a sense, he's always been one. Social democrats believe in socialism. They believe in public control over the means of production. They just, they just don't believe that it will be a revolution. They believe that capitalism will just kind of naturally evolve into socialism. And at this point, I would say Bernie Sanders is not a social democrat. He's a liberal, right? He doesn't advocate socialism any longer. He advocates a social democratic welfare state. So in that sense, Bernie Sanders is not really a social democrat anymore, and he's always kind of been one. He hung out with Trotskyists, he hung out with Communist Party USA people, and even some Maoists in the 70s. But 70s and 80s, he was a social democrat still. He was never one of them. He was never a revolutionary. He was never a communist, right? I mean, he was friendly to the Nicaraguan Sandinista. He went to Cuba. He went to the Soviet Union a few times, but he was never a full-on communist revolutionary. He was always a social democrat. And I guess, in like the 90s, he started to back away from social democracy and became kind of what he is, a populist leftist. Lenin was in the Social Democratic Party. Exactly. Social democracy, or that's the parties of the Second International. Those are reformist socialists who actually want to achieve socialism. And in the 90s, the Labour Party, big social democratic party in the United Kingdom, dropped Clause 4 from its constitution, from its bylaws, right? It dropped the part that said they wanted socialism. It just said socialism means a good economy for everyone. No longer wanted control of the means of production, right? The French Socialist Party dropped socialism. Now the Norwegian Socialist Party still on paper believes in socialism. They don't do much about it, but they still believe in it, right? There's a couple other, Austria, places like that, where the social democrats are still social democrats. But for the most part, the social democratic parties did what Bernie did. They all kind of stopped being social democrats. Bernie is significantly to the left of the Democrats. He's more of a populist. He's more of a Keynesian, Rooseveltian welfare state advocate. So that's to his credit. But yeah, I think that it was just, that's the way the wind was blowing. In the 90s, social democracy dropped socialism. And Bernie, being a good social democrat, dropped socialism along with them. Disappointing, but he's better than not. His movement is amazing. I admire his movement. Is Myanmar communist? No, it is not. What would you say the biggest grievance the Chinese people have with the Communist Party is? Okay. Is Myanmar communist? No, it's not. Right? It's a military junta. Sometimes it's more pro-China, and it goes back and forth. Sometimes it's more pro-China. Sometimes it's more pro-U.S. But at this point, it's very, very pro-China. But it's not communist. I wouldn't call it a socialist country. It's very much it's kind of like Singapore. I see the biggest grievance. It's kind of like Singapore. It's a lot like the Asian tiger countries where you have like a military government. It's a Bonapartist military regime. I don't see it as a communist regime. Kashmir. Yeah, I think Muslims in India are brutally oppressed, in my opinion. There's horrendous treatment of them, and the Kashmir territory is a great example of that. And that anti-Islamic bigotry in India is horrendous, and that Kashmir, the people there are being deprived of their sovereignty. I think that Kashmir should be independent. That's my position. But that said, I know this is in many ways an ethnic conflict. But yeah, it looks to me like Muslims in India are badly treated, and Kashmir should be independent. Okay, Bahrain. Yeah, brutal U.S.-backed military dictatorship. Bolivia and Nicaragua. All right. Okay. Bahrain, it's a city, a small country. It's got a U.S. and Saudi-backed monarchy that's imposed on the population. The majority of the people in Bahrain are Shia Muslims. The regime in Bahrain is Wahhabi, Sunni autocracy. The United States backs up a brutal military dictatorship there. The people of Bahrain go out in the streets to march for freedom, and they get shot down and beaten up and arrested. There's a lot of political prisoners who are Shia Muslims who are in the prisons right now, suffering and dangers of COVID-19 and such. And yeah, it's a great example of hypocrisy. The United States is opposing the people of Bahrain who want freedom. And it's not just Shia in Bahrain. There's Sunnis who also want freedom. It's an autocracy. And, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the people overthrew it during the Arab Spring. In 2011, the people of Bahrain overthrew the government, and Saudi Arabia sent in the military to kill people in the streets and reimpose the brutal dictatorship on Bahrain. That's just a fact. That's just a fact. All right, and no one can deny this, that the United States doesn't really believe in democracy. If it did, it would order Saudi Arabia to pull its troops out. It would stop. And Bahrain, that's where U.S. military bases are all set up, right? There's all kinds of U.S. military personnel operating out of Bahrain. I don't want to answer that question, Ali. I appreciate you asking, but I'm not going to go there. It's an organization in Lebanon. I don't want to say too much more about it. I'm a little bit tired, but thanks for asking. But yeah, that's the situation with Bahrain. Biggest grievances with China, I think corruption, right? The fact that President Xi Jinping, has waged this crackdown on corruption. That's probably the biggest grievance. The fact that he's become so popular. Xi Jinping has become so popular because he opposes corruption probably shows that there's deep problems with corruption. And I know a lot of people in China have told me the corruption there is a big, big problem in local areas. So I think that's probably the biggest grievance. And so the crackdown and President Xi's mass line campaign, that's what he calls it, is the mass line campaign. It's a crackdown on corruption. That's what's made him so popular. And I think that's because, it's probably because there's a big problem with corruption. So, there you go about that. All right. Bolivia and Nicaragua. Nicaragua is still socialist. Bolivia obviously had a coup. The government, the government was overthrown. The military toppled the government. Even though the polls showed in Bolivia, that Evo Morales would have won the election, right? And the fraud was not on. There was some fraud, but it wasn't enough to impact the vote. The Organization of American States. Yes, there was a little bit of fraud. It wasn't enough to impact the vote. Evo Morales won the election. The people voted for socialism. Regardless, they overthrew the government. And stupid people on the internet thought this was a human rights protest. It was about freedom. Bullshit. And now we're seeing the horrendous results of what has happened in Bolivia ever since Morales has been overthrown. And Áñez is she's presiding over the regime. She hasn't totally dismantled the economics of socialism yet. I mean, she's trying to. She's trying to privatize things. But revolutionary forces no longer control the government. That's clear. That's very, very clear. Now, many people have looked at Bolivia and said, well, what makes Bolivia different than Nicaragua and Venezuela is that Morales was never able to completely change the military. In Venezuela, the military is trained in Cuba. The military is more pro-communist than the population is. They are like the most solid supporters. I've seen it. The military of Venezuela are more communist. They are the most communist people. Bolivia, not so much. For whatever reason, the balance of forces, I think Morales wanted to change the military. But the balance of forces, he wasn't able to change the military like they were able to do in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, the military itself comes out of the revolution. You have to remember that, right? I mean, the Nicaraguan military that exists is the military that overthrew, Somoza. It was, and in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez came out of the military. Bolivarianism originated in the military. But in Bolivia, it was a push and pull. Some of the military were supporters of Morales, but not all of them. And it wasn't like Chile in 1973, where it was just completely, it was like the military was all against the government. But it was a push and pull, and Morales was never really able to impose total control over the military. And so that was a weakness. And it's interesting because there was a coup in Paraguay, I believe. It was a similar situation. And what happened was that they actually charged the president with trying to impose political controls on the military. When the elected government starts to change the military, that's what they don't like. And there's an article in the Wall Street Journal where they call that democratic regression, right? When the military, when you start to change with what they call independent institutions, they call it, that's when they claim it's democratic regression. You're allowed to get elected, but you're not allowed to change the military. You're not allowed to change the intelligence agencies. You're not allowed to change the economy. And if you do that, then it stops being democracy, according to the United States. And they don't tolerate that. And they were able to do it in Venezuela. They were able to do it, they were able to not completely undo it. They did it in Nicaragua. They had a socialist violent revolution in Nicaragua. They voted them out of office in the 1990s, but they were not able to completely roll it all back. The revolutionaries got into power in 2006. Nicaragua is a socialist country. Venezuela is a socialist country. Bolivia has had a counter-revolution, and the state never fully changed hands. The state, Morales did amazing progressive things, but the state was still, there was still a push and pull. The military, he got a new constitution, but the military was never completely changed, and that was one of the problems in Bolivia. And that shows that the state, right? Lenin wrote this book, The State and Revolution. The state determines everything, right? And William Z. Foster, he wrote in a very important pamphlet in defense of the Communist Party that if a socialist government in the United States got elected, if an anti-monopoly government got elected, they would have to change the military. They would have to change the Constitution. They would have to, they would have to take these dramatic moves. If not, they would be overthrown, right? In order to, protect an elected socialist peaceful transition, you have to change society. It's not enough to just pass nationalizations of industries. You have to change the nature of society. You have to build workers' councils and community assemblies to back up your revolution. You have to change the nature of the business community. You have to change the nature of all kinds of things. You have to do that, right? We socialists, legitimate socialists, aspire to take power peacefully. But once taking power peacefully, they have to start changing society. If you don't change society, if you don't start changing society, and if things like the military don't change, if things like the courts don't change, things like, universities don't change, the university system doesn't change. If you take power and don't change society, it's a big problem. Morales did change society very significantly. He did a lot to change society. But there was a lot of aspects of the military that didn't change. Some of the military changed, not all the military changed. Okay. Yes, it's after midnight here, folks. I am exhausted. Thank you for all those super chats. I do appreciate it. Young Stalin is a really good book. I'm halfway through it. Isn't it great? I mean, he just comes across as like this most romantic young revolutionary. Fascinating book. I loved Young Stalin. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm quoting it actually in the new book to make a point, but I'm not going to tell you all about what that is. But thanks for being here with me tonight, folks. I really enjoy being with you all. I really enjoy answering your questions. I'm a little tired. I've got a little bit of a headache, but that's fine, right? It's a great night. Working hard. Hardly working, as they say, right? So I'm going to cut it off here. I'm just going to end it the way I always do. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, I'm out of here. Thanks, folks.